Hello fellow sapiens, sit back, relax, and prepare to meet the next chapter of our reflection. Tonight we travel about 2 million years into the past to meet the first maker, Homo habilis. This is part of our Human Origin series, a quiet exploration of how intelligence, survival and invention slowly intertwined. If the first walker changed how we moved, this one changed how we thought. You're listening to Sleepless Homo, soft science and slow storytelling for sleepless minds. Here, we move through deep time gently, guided not by certainty, but by curiosity. Every chipped stone, every fossilized handprint is a whisper from the long apprenticeship of our species. Imagine a world where the branches above you vanish, where the sun becomes a furnace, and where the very ground beneath your feet begins to demand a different way of moving. What happens when an ape built for forests finds the trees disappearing? In eastern Africa, roughly 2.5 million years ago, the climate was beginning to wrench the landscape away from the familiar green canopy of woods and thrust it into a new struggle. The expansion of open grasslands, of savanna stretching in waves across the Rift Valley. The record etched into lake-bottom sediments and fossil soils points to a long contraction of forested zones and the gradual spread of grasses and shrubs in their place. For generations, the ancestors of humans roamed the trees. Their bodies adapted to climbing, hanging, leaping from twig to trunk, gathering fruit, ever alert to the rustle of predators below. Then the world changed. As the forest receded, the ladder of branches vanished beneath their hands, and the ground, flat, exposed, unpredictable, became both trap and opportunity. The term often used is savanna mosaic, not just open plains, but broken landscapes where patches of woodland gave way to grass, scrub, rock. Researchers note that between about 2.5 and 1.5 million years ago, frequent swings between wet and dry conditions created a patchwork of habitats rather than a simple shift from trees to grass. In this shifting horizon, survival demanded innovation. The forest-clinging body plan, curved fingers, long arms reaching for branches, was increasingly at odds with the new demands of standing on the ground, walking, running, scouting open terrain. Being vertical became an advantage. You could scan for predators, see over tall grasses, carry objects, use your hands. The fossil and paleo-environmental evidence suggests that some of our forebears started to walk upright more often when the woodland was shrinking and open ground. But the transition was far from simple. The grasses provided little shade, the trees fewer hiding spots. Predators lurked in the open, and waterholes became dangerous intersections. At the same time, the new terrain opened fresh possibilities. Herds of grazing animals, dead carcasses in open ground, bones with marrow hidden inside. For an upright primate with suitable hands and an observant mind, the savanna offered something different. Raw materials for a change in behaviour. Yet we must remember, we don't know everything. The evidence is fragmentary. The bones are partial. The sediments layered unevenly. What we do know whispers this: the environmental pressure was intense, persistent, and formative. One major scientific review concluded that the origin of our genus Homo is closely tied to the expansion of grasslands at the expense of trees. Imagine for a moment, your ancestor walks out of a thicket into grass that reaches the knees of a modern human. The sky is wide and glaring. The shade of foliage is gone. You peer across the plain, alert for the glint of movement. Your hands hang free. Below, at your feet, bones of large creatures lie bleached white. The smell of lion and hyena drifts in gusts of wind. You must decide, climb a tree for safety or run on 2 legs across unstable turf, exposed but mobile. In that crucible of change, something remarkable happened. Bodies adapted, behaviours shifted, brains began to reorganise. Upright posture, freeing of the hands, venturing into open terrain. These were no longer odd variations, but life-saving traits. The forest dweller became the ground roamer, the grassland walker, and in doing so set a foundation for later steps in our story. The world at that time did not wait patiently. Climate pulses, periods of sudden dryness or moisture, rattled the ecosystem. Lakes shrank and swelled. Vegetation reorganized. The mosaic of trees and grass turned ever more open, more unpredictable. Hominins faced a world where permanence vanished. Adapt or disappear. Scientists term this a turnover pulse environment, where many species were forced into new niches or vanished altogether. For the groups who remained, the ground became a classroom. Every step, every scan across grass, every fallen branch was a lesson in risk and reward. The survival calculus changed. Climbing high for fruit gave way to walking far for water, watching flanks for predators rather than branches for monkeys. Hands were no longer just for grasping branches. They became tools of survival in a new sense, though we'll explore that later. As dusk fell across the savanna, those who lay on the ground had fewer places to hide. They huddled by rocks, by small sheltered depressions, by thorny shrubs. The night brought wolves, cats, hyenas. The shift from forest to open ground meant that staying motionless was no longer safe. Staying alert, being ready to move, became the new normal. To simply survive the nights became as important as finding food by day. And yet, in the face of danger, opportunity lay beneath the surface. The grassland herds that replaced trees carried bones and marrow, and carcasses left by larger predators offered resources for the clever and nimble. The ground was no longer just underfoot, it was a terrain of possibility. In this uncertain landscape, our ancestors learned to walk differently. They leaned forward less, they balanced more. The feet struck the ground with different rhythm. Over many generations their anatomy responded, yet the fossil record remains incomplete. We do not know exactly when each change occurred, or which population first mastered it. What we understand is that by the time the earliest known stone tools appear, these anatomical and behavioural shifts were well underway. The forest had been safe and insulating, but the savanna demanded invention. In the wide openness, the dangers multiplied. Open ground offers no branches to climb, no canopy to hide under. But it also provides clarity. You can see further, move faster, carry things. The ladder of branches may have vanished, but a new ladder of innovation reached down from the sky into the grasping hands of two-legged walkers. And so the stage was set. The environment around 2.5 million years ago acted as a sculptor of life, carving out the form and habits of a new kind of being. Our ancestors did not leave the trees because they wished to. The trees left them. Their world became open, risky, and still full of potential. That is the world into which the first true makers stepped. As the dawn of the Pleistocene rose, a small figure stood on two legs, looked across grasslands, and grasped the challenge of existence in a changing world. The trees were gone. Now it was ground beneath their feet, horizon ahead, and survival in their hands. And as we watch that figure, we must ask ourselves, when the world changes beneath your feet, what do you do next? If you enjoy wandering through prehistory like this, calmly, without noise or rush, consider subscribing or leaving a like. It helps other sleepless thinkers find their way back through deep time. And tell me in the comments, how do you listen? While falling asleep? While working? On a quiet night drive? If you drift off mid-story, there are timestamps below so you can return when you wake. Now, let's step into the Olduvai Gorge, where a small being once picked up a stone, and in that instant began to change everything. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Imagine this. A pebble no bigger than your palm, chipped by accident, or perhaps on purpose, until one edge gleams sharper than bone. In that glint lies the beginning of every tool you've ever used, every invention that would one day shape the world. But around 2.5 million years ago, no one could have known that a single flake of stone would mark a turning point for life on Earth. The Savanna stretched dry and endless, filled with the sounds of wind and wings, and among the scattered carcasses left by predators, something new was stirring. The first stone tools were not masterpieces of engineering. They were crude, heavy, irregular. A rock struck against another to peel away a flake, leaving an edge sharp enough to slice flesh or crack open the bones of a fallen gazelle. Yet this simple act, repeating what nature sometimes did by chance, hinted at a new kind of mind, one that saw potential in matter, one that looked at a rock and saw not just a rock, but possibility. For millions of years, animals had used the world as it was. Now, something had begun to shape it. Archaeologists call these earliest tools the Olduvai industry, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where many were first discovered. But their story stretches beyond one site or one species. The oldest known examples come from Lomekwi in Kenya, dated to roughly 3.3 million years ago, before our genus even existed. They suggest that toolmaking may have begun with Australopithecines, long before Homo habilis arrived. These were not isolated accidents. Dozens of flakes, cores and hammerstones lie scattered across ancient riverbeds, each bearing the unmistakable scars of deliberate percussion. Striking stone against stone is not easy. It requires precision, strength, and understanding of how fractures travel through different kinds of a rock. Even the simplest flake is a record of intent. By about 2.6 million years ago, the Olduvai toolkit had spread widely across eastern Africa. At sites like Gona and Nyanga, researchers have found thousands of artifacts alongside animal bones, some with cut marks still visible under microscopes. The pattern is consistent: flakes with razor-like edges, hammerstones showing impact points, and bones split open in the same way again and again. These were not random strikes, but rehearsed gestures, an early choreography of cognition and survival. The hands that held those stones were small, the fingers thick and strong, the thumbs already capable of powerful grips. In those hands, the first evidence of human agency took shape. But why pick up stone at all? In the harsh ecosystems of the early Pleistocene, meat was a rare and valuable source of calories. Predators killed often, scavengers waited for their turn, and among them, these early tool users found an opening. With stone flakes, they could slice through hides too tough for teeth and access nutrient-rich marrow within bones that other animals couldn't break. A single cracked femur could yield hundreds of calories. It was a new kind of resource, invisible to most of the savanna's inhabitants, but visible now to those who could think ahead. A stone, properly shaped, could turn a scavenger into a survivor. At Nyanga, Kenya, a discovery shook the timeline further. Tools of the Olduvai type were found alongside the remains of Paranthropus, a genus once thought to be purely vegetarian. This raised an uncomfortable question. What if the first toolmakers weren't even human in the strict sense? Perhaps multiple species were experimenting with the same idea at once, converging toward the same revelation. Tool use, then, may not have been a single spark igniting the human story, but a slow, smouldering process, a shared awakening among different cousins, all responding to the same environmental pressures. The Olduvai toolkit was deceptively simple. It included just a few basic forms: the core, the flake, and the hammerstone. A core was the original rock from which sharp flakes were struck. Each flake had a razor edge useful for slicing meat or scraping hides. The hammerstone was a tougher rock used to hit the core at a specific angle, producing the flake. From this triangle of materials came an infinite variety of uses. Yet what mattered most wasn't the tool itself. It was the knowledge required to make it. Every chip, every scar on a stone recorded a decision. The right angle of percussion, the right force, the right choice of rock. Such knowledge, passed through observation or imitation, marks the dawn of learning as a shared inheritance. In the fossil record, these tools appear in layers alongside bones of antelope, elephants, and hippos, suggesting that toolmakers moved along riverbanks and floodplains. They followed the water and the herds, their camps temporary and opportunistic. Each site tells a slightly different story. At Gona, bones show both cut marks and gnaw marks, evidence that early humans sometimes scavenged what lions left behind. At other sites, the sequence reverses, with cut marks appearing first, suggesting that in some cases they reached the carcass before other predators. These subtle differences hint at the beginnings of competition and planning. To survive, one had to arrive early, act quickly, and move on before danger returned. What separates the older one from random stone breakage is not the tool itself, but the consistency of technique. When archaeologists compare flakes made by accident, say, from trampling or rockfalls, with those made deliberately, the difference is unmistakable. Human-made flakes have specific angles, conchoidal fractures, and impact points that repeat across thousands of examples. This is how we know intention existed even without language to describe it. It's one of the few moments in the fossil record where behaviour, not anatomy, gives the clue. Over time, this reliance on stone began to shape not just survival, but perception. With tools, the landscape transformed. Rocks became resources. Bones became opportunities. Each element of the environment gained potential value. To strike one stone with another is to imagine change, to see one thing as capable of becoming something else. It's not simply tool use, it's tool vision. Other animals use objects. Crows bend wires, otters crack shells. But shaping matter into a form that can be reused for new purposes, this is a different leap entirely. It requires foresight, memory, and abstraction. Still, we must be careful not to romanticize this moment. The first tools were brutal instruments of survival, born of necessity, not creativity. They left no art, no decoration, no symbol. They were simply extensions of hunger. Each flake struck was an act of adaptation to a harsher world. But even survival carries the seeds of imagination. Once a species learns that its hands can alter the environment, the boundaries of possibility begin to shift. The Olduvai marks that boundary. The act of making such tools would have been loud and physical. Imagine the rhythmic clack of stone against stone echoing through a dry riverbed, sparks occasionally flashing in the dusk, chips of rock flying, dust rising, and the focused gaze of a creature learning by doing. Archaeologists have tried to recreate these gestures in the lab. Experimental knappers find that even producing a few usable flakes requires not only strength, but fine motor control and an understanding of how to angle the blow. The brain must coordinate the eyes, hands, and memory of previous strikes. Each successful flake is a moment of feedback, a primitive loop of perception and refinement. The implications ripple far beyond a single tool. Once stone entered the behavioural repertoire, it became a stable technology, something that could be taught, remembered, and improved upon. It didn't die with the individual. It survived across generations, embedded in the rhythm of living. The Olduvai culture, if we can call it that, lasted for nearly 1 million years with astonishing consistency. In evolutionary terms, that is a triumph of stability. These tools were so effective for so long that they outlived multiple species that used them. They are the first known human invention to persist across both time and geography. And yet, even here, there is humility in the evidence. We still do not know exactly which species struck the first flakes, or how widely the skill spread. The fossil record is fragmentary, the lines between species blurred. Bones and tools rarely appear in the same layer, and when they do, it's not always clear who made what. Archaeology is, in many ways, the art of reading absence. We infer lives from what remains when everything else has vanished. Every chipped stone is both proof and mystery. By the time we reach around 2 million years ago, the evidence begins to align more clearly with the appearance of Homo habilis, the handy human. It is here that toolmaking becomes not just an occasional behaviour but a defining trait. While others may have experimented with stone, Homo habilis seems to have lived by it. Sites from Tanzania to Ethiopia reveal clusters of tools and bones that suggest repeated use and transport of materials. These early humans were no longer at the mercy of chance. They were beginning to engineer survival. If you could hold one of these flakes today, it would fit easily in your hand, its edge still sharp after 2 million years. The surface would bear the scars of ancient impacts, the rhythm of trial and error. It is both artifact and autobiography. A record of the first-time intention left a physical trace on Earth. And as simple as it seems, it carries the same lineage of thought that would one day build ships, telescopes, and satellites. The gesture that began here, under the African sun, never truly ended. So what really changed when we picked up stone? Maybe not everything at first. The world remained vast, dangerous, and unyielding. But from that moment on, survival was no longer only about adapting to the environment, it was about adapting the environment to us. That distinction, subtle yet profound, is the thread that connects every hammer, every blade, every tool that followed. The first maker did not know they were changing history. They were only trying to eat. But in the rhythm of stone against stone, the spark of something irreversible began. And that spark, carried in the hands of small beings 2 million years ago, still burns quietly in ours. Imagine this. A small figure moving through the tall grass, walking upright beneath a sky that stretched forever. It's not quite ape, not quite human, something in between, a body designed for 2 worlds. It can climb when it must, balance when it should, and think just enough to notice that the world around it has changed. The trees are sparser now, the shade fleeting. To survive, this being must move farther, faster, and differently. That creature was Homo habilis, the handy human, and though its hands were small, they carried the weight of a coming age. When Homo habilis first appeared, sometime around 2.4 million years ago, Africa was still in flux. The forests had retreated, replaced by mosaic landscapes of scrub and grassland. Rivers meandered across open plains, and volcanic ridges framed the horizon. Out here, the balance between prey and predator was a constant tension, and to exist at all required adaptation. In the fossil record, habilis emerges as a new silhouette in this ancient drama. Shorter than us, lighter, but undeniably human in outline. Adults stood roughly 1 to 1.3 metres tall and weighed around 30 kilograms, closer in size to a modern child than a full-grown human. Yet within that small frame was the architecture of something revolutionary. The skeleton of Homo habilis tells a story of compromise. The arms remained long, almost simian, built for climbing with strength and reach. The legs, however, had begun to lengthen compared to earlier Australopithecines, their joints angled for balance and endurance on 2 feet. The pelvis had flattened and widened, stabilising the body during walking, while the spine curved gently to support an upright posture. These shifts may seem modest, but they mark a critical threshold. With every stride, habilis carried its centre of gravity forward, freeing its hands for tasks other than motion. That small anatomical liberation, hands that could act while feet carried the body, would change everything that followed. Fossils like those from Olduvai Gorge and Kubifora offer us glimpses of what habilis truly looked like. The face was still primitive, with a projecting jaw and strong brow ridges, yet the skull was subtly expanded. The brain case, measuring between 500 and 700 cubic centimetres, was larger than that of any Australopithecine before it, nearly double the size of a chimpanzee's. Though still far smaller than our own, this increase hints at new complexity. The shape of the skull reveals a rounder dome, suggesting an enlarged frontal region, the part of the brain linked to planning, coordination, and fine motor skills. The forehead was shallow, the nose flat, but behind those features neural circuitry was reorganizing. Evolution rarely announces itself loudly. It whispers through small changes repeated over generations. Even the teeth tell the tale of transition. In Australopithecines, the jaws were heavy and the molars massive, built for grinding tough vegetation. In Habilis, the teeth are smaller and more gracile, especially the canines and incisors, resembling our own more closely. The jaws themselves are lighter, with reduced muscle attachment ridges. This suggests a shift toward a more varied diet, perhaps softer foods, scavenged meat, or roots processed with tools, though we leave that story for another time. The key here is refinement. The mouth was no longer the only tool. The hands were taking over, and what hands they were. The fossils of habilis hands are among the most revealing ever found. The bones show a combination of strength and dexterity, a powerful grip paired with remarkable flexibility. The thumb is long and fully opposable, allowing precise manipulation. The joints of the wrist are shaped to resist the stresses of forceful, repetitive movements like striking stone or peeling flakes. In modern, anatomical terms, habilis possessed the first truly human hand. It could press, pinch and control objects with intention. When paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey examined these fossils in the early 20th century, he immediately recognised what made them special. These were hands that could make tools, and so the name habilis, from the Latin for handy or skilled, was born. Standing upright on the Savanna, this early human was not fast, nor was it strong compared to the predators it faced. But it had endurance, adaptability, and a growing capacity to shape the world around it. The long arms that once pulled its ancestors up trees now carried stones, branches, and food across open terrain. Its eyes, placed forward with overlapping fields of vision, judged distance and movement with accuracy. Its ears heard the rustle of grass and the footfall of danger. The very structure of its body, compact, alert, mobile, suggests a creature designed not to dominate but to endure. Habilis likely moved between the open plains by day and the safety of trees at night. Its curved fingers, inherited from arboreal ancestors, made climbing easy when rest or refuge was needed. It could sleep above the reach of predators, cradled in the crook of a branch, then descend with the dawn to explore the riverbanks and valleys below. This dual existence, half ground, half canopy, must have shaped its sense of the world. Every day required vigilance, every night caution. Yet within that tension was opportunity. The ground offered access to resources unseen by the apes that stayed in the trees, carcasses, bones, and the materials of invention. The bones of habilis are scattered across eastern Africa like breadcrumbs in time. At Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, fragments of skulls and hands have been found near the same layers as primitive stone tools. At Kubifora in Kenya, partial skeletons reveal proportions of arms and legs that confirm habitual bipedalism. Even fragmentary remains, like the famous specimen KNMER 1813, tell us that this species varied in shape and size, some smaller, some more robust, but united by shared adaptations toward the human form. Each discovery adds another brushstroke to a portrait of a species balancing between what it was and what it would become. The environment that nurtured habilis was unpredictable. Shifting climates brought alternating periods of rainfall and drought. Lakes appeared and vanished. Forests expanded and shrank. These cycles likely influenced everything from diet to movement patterns. Flexibility was survival. The anatomy of habilis reflects that necessity. Versatile limbs, efficient gait, and a compact build capable of covering long distances. Unlike its heavy-jawed cousins, habilis was not specialized for a single food source or habitat. It was a generalist, and generalists more than specialists often endure. Still, habilis was not alone. Other hominins roamed Africa at the same time, some larger, some more robust. But habilis occupied a unique niche. It was the first to fully commit to a bipedal life without abandoning its heritage of climbing. It was not the biggest, nor the most imposing, but it was curious and adaptive. That combination, alertness paired with physical potential, marks the quiet beginning of a pattern that would come to define our lineage. In reconstructing habilis, paleoartists and scientists alike walk a fine line between data and imagination. We have no skin, no fur, no colour, only bones and stone to guide us. Yet through comparative anatomy and biomechanical modelling, we can picture how this being might have moved. A slightly stooped posture, short stride, head balanced delicately atop the spine. The body covered with sparse dark hair, the face expressive, the eyes forward and bright with awareness. Not an ape, but not yet us, a prototype of possibility. If you could stand beside one, you might be surprised by how familiar it feels. The curve of the shoulders, the tension in the hands, the rhythm of its walk, they echo faintly within our own bodies. Each of us still carries those ancient compromises, the back that aches from upright posture, the foot that remembers gripping branches, the thumb that still fits perfectly around a tool. Evolution never starts fresh. It edits, reuses, and refines. Habilis was one such draft, a version of humanity still being written. What we know of this species comes from fragments, yet even those fragments hold extraordinary depth. Each fossil reveals not just anatomy, but behaviour. The wear on teeth shows what it chewed. The ridges of bone trace the pull of muscle. The curvature of the fingers hints at how it gripped. Science has learned to read these silent signatures with increasing precision, but there remains a humility in the process. For all our technology, we still reconstruct an entire world from pieces small enough to fit in a hand. We can describe how habilis lived, but the why, what it felt, feared or imagined, will always remain just beyond the fossil line. And yet, we can sense it. In the shape of those hands, in the weight they could carry, we recognise the earliest gestures of what would one day be called human. Hands that could hold, create, and change. Feet that could travel. Eyes that could look ahead. Homo habilis stood at the intersection of instinct and intention. It was not fully one or the other. It was something new, something fragile, something extraordinary. So when we ask who first stepped out onto the Savanna stage, the answer is not just a species. It is a moment in evolution when the Earth itself began to look back. A creature that could shape stone, but also be shaped by its own invention. A being still clinging to the branches, yet already reaching for the future. Imagine this. You're a small, upright creature wandering through an endless plain. The air is dry, the sun relentless, and the world around you hums with danger. Your stomach aches. You've already eaten roots, berries, and whatever scraps the day offered. But in the distance lies something new. The half-picked carcass of an antelope, left behind by lions who have had their fill. The smell is sharp, the flies thick. And for the first time, your mind doesn't just see what is left, it sees what could be taken. In your hand is a stone sharp-edged from yesterday's work. You kneel, strike, and taste something that no ape before you ever truly mastered. Marrow, the liquid gold of the Savanna. It's not just a meal, it's fuel for a new kind of brain. Around 2 million years ago, something extraordinary began unfolding inside the skull of Homo habilis. The brain, that fragile organ of possibility, was growing larger, swelling beyond the limits of its predecessors. The fossil record tells us that these early humans carried brains ranging from about 500 to nearly 800 cubic centimetres, depending on the individual. That might not sound large next to ours, but compared to the Australopithecines who came before, it was a dramatic leap. Inside that extra space, neurons multiplied, connections deepened, and energy demands soared. The brain, though small in size, was already becoming the body's hungriest organ. Brains are greedy. Even in modern humans, they consume roughly a fifth of the body's total energy, despite weighing only a fraction of its mass. For habilis, this was no different. Only the supply lines were thinner, the world harsher. To support a growing brain under such conditions required a radical change in diet. Fruit alone could not sustain it, nor could fibrous roots or seeds. These foods fill the stomach but starve the mind. Something more concentrated, more calorie-dense was needed. The answer came not from new teeth or digestive tracts, but from hands that had learned to hold stone. By this time, Homo habilis had already begun mastering the Olduvai toolkit. These were not weapons, but instruments of access, the first keys to locked resources. A flake could slice meat more efficiently than any claw. A hammerstone could shatter bone where no jaw could bite. Archaeological sites across eastern Africa preserve the story in mute testimony. Stone flakes scattered beside animal bones, split cleanly to expose the inner marrow. Under the microscope, fine parallel striations trace where edges cut through tendon and hide. The pattern repeats across sites and across centuries, suggesting that habilis didn't just stumble upon this behaviour, it had learned it. This new ability didn't make habilis a hunter yet, but it transformed it into a far more effective scavenger. Every carcass on the Savanna became an opportunity to harvest fat, marrow and protein, resources rich in the precise nutrients that a growing brain craves. The energy density of marrow packed with lipids and long-chain fatty acids is extraordinary. These fats, especially the omega variants, are critical for neural development and maintenance. With each successful meal, the body could redirect more energy toward the brain, sustaining longer periods of alertness, learning, and planning. The relationship between nourishment and cognition wasn't abstract. It was immediate, physical, and survival-based. Chemical evidence backs this up. Isotopic analysis of habilis fossils reveals traces consistent with a mixed diet that included both plant matter and animal tissue. Tooth enamel chemistry indicates variability, an omnivorous pattern flexible enough to exploit what the environment offered. This adaptability may have been the real secret. Habilis didn't abandon its plant-based roots, it expanded its menu. It could still chew tubers, dig for bulbs and gather fruits when the rains came. But when food was scarce, it could pivot, to bones, to carcasses, to the scattered leftovers of the plains. Every calorie counted, and every new source of energy brought another day of thought. This flexibility set off what many researchers now describe as a feedback loop, a quiet, relentless circle of cause and effect. Better nutrition supported brain growth. A larger brain improved coordination, perception, and memory. Those abilities in turn enabled better foraging strategies and more precise tool-making, which unlocked yet more food sources. It was not a leap but a spiral, slow, steady, cumulative. Evolution is patient like that. It does not plan. It builds upon what works. And what worked was the partnership between food and thought. In fossils of habilis skulls, you can see this feedback written in bone. The cranium bulges slightly more than in any ape before it. The forehead slopes, but less dramatically. The impressions left by the brain surface suggest an expansion of regions linked to motor control and spatial reasoning, the parts of the brain that coordinate hands and eyes. It is tempting to see this as destiny, the first draft of the mind that would one day write, paint, and dream. But in truth, it was a necessity born of hunger. Intelligence did not emerge from comfort. It emerged from pressure, from the need to outthink starvation. The change wasn't only internal. A larger brain meant a longer period of growth and dependency. Though the social lives of habilis remain mostly a mystery, it's likely that feeding the young became an even more delicate challenge. Mothers would have needed to balance mobility with nourishment, finding food dense enough to support both herself and her offspring. Energy scarcity can shape everything from lifespan to reproduction, and in the story of Habilis, it shaped the architecture of possibility. The brain demanded payment, and evolution learned to pay in meat and marrow. If we could watch Habilis eat, it might surprise us how familiar the gestures feel. Sitting on haunches beside a carcass, gripping a stone flake, stripping flesh in rhythmic pulls, the motions are precise, practiced. These creatures were not roaring victors at the top of the food chain, but quiet opportunists waiting for their moment. A lion's meal became their inheritance. Their satisfaction came not from dominance but from persistence. Each successful feeding was a small victory against extinction. But what did that energy feel like? It's impossible to know. Did they feel sharper after a meal? More alert to the world's patterns? Did they notice that certain foods brought endurance, others sluggishness? Or was the change invisible, buried deep within their cells, neurons firing a bit faster, memories lasting a bit longer? Whatever the subjective experience, the outcome was monumental. Within a few 100,000 years, the pattern became irreversible. The brain would continue to grow, and so too would its appetite. This transformation also had consequences for time itself. Once brains demanded higher energy intake, life had to reorganize around finding it. Every day became a balance between calories gained and calories spent. Movement patterns likely followed animal migrations, water sources, and seasonal vegetation. Energy dictated behavior, and behavior reshaped evolution. The growing brain became both a blessing and a burden, a marvel that required constant feeding. Nature does not give intelligence for free. It charges in blood, effort, and risk. There is a quiet irony in this. The same organ that allowed Habilis to solve problems was itself the source of a new one. To think more required to eat more. To eat more required to move farther, to plan better, to cooperate, even if only loosely. The brain made them capable, but also dependent. This is a pattern that has never really left us. Even today, every human thought, memory, and dream runs on the same ancient exchange. Energy turned into awareness. Fossilized skulls and bones can tell us dimensions and volume, but they can't tell us the moment of realization, the spark, when Habilis first began to rely on its own mind as its greatest survival tool. Perhaps it wasn't a single moment at all, but a gradual recognition spread across generations, a species learning, without knowing it, that its future depended on what it could think as much as what it could eat. By the time the lineage of Habilis reached the later stages of its existence, brain and diet were locked in an evolutionary embrace. Each reinforced the other, neither could go back. From that partnership would eventually rise the larger-brained humans that followed, but in this early chapter, it was still an experiment, an untested balance between nourishment and intellect. A creature learning not just to live, but to live by thought. The mind, even then, was already hungry. Imagine this. The grass is still wet with dew, the air humming with flies, and the bones of a gazelle lie half hidden beneath the golden light of a new day. A pride of the lions fed here last night, their growls still echoing faintly from the hills. The vultures have already landed, tearing what scraps remain. But now, from the brush, another figure emerges, smaller, cautious, carrying a stone in one hand. It isn't a predator. It isn't fast or strong or armed with claws, yet it walks with purpose. This is Homo habilis, the handy human, approaching the carcass of a much larger creature with the calm precision of an animal that has learned to wait its turn. Roughly 1,900,000 years ago, the African plains had become one of the most competitive ecosystems on Earth. As the climate cooled and dried, forests shrank, grassland spread, and large carnivores flourished. Saber-toothed cats, hyenas, wild dogs, and early lions ruled the daylight hunt, their speed and muscle unmatched. For a small biped like Homo habilis, survival in this environment required strategy. Direct confrontation meant death. But patience, timing, and a well-placed flake of stone could yield a feast that no other scavenger could access. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Olduvai Gorge, Kubifora, and Sterkfontein tells this story in remarkable detail. Fossil bones uncovered there bear two kinds of markings: deep, U-shaped grooves from carnivore teeth and thin, parallel scratches made by sharp-edged tools. When studied under magnification, the order of these marks reveals something crucial. In many cases, the cut marks overlay the tooth marks, meaning hominins arrived after the predators had fed. This was no lion's kill stolen mid-hunt. It was the remains of a meal, revisited by smaller, cleverer creatures who knew exactly where to cut. They didn't need to chase or kill. They needed only to arrive at the right time. For the first time, tools allowed these early humans to enter the predator's domain without fear of exclusion. A scavenged carcass, especially one with intact bones, was a treasure chest of calories waiting to be unlocked. The thick hides and sinews that deterred weaker animals could now be opened with stone. Using hammerstones, Homo habilis could shatter femurs and skulls to reach the marrow and brain, both dense in fat and protein, both invaluable to a hungry primate. Marrow in particular was a survival goldmine, rich in nutrients that could be stored and metabolized efficiently, perfect for fueling the energy-hungry brain. Picture the moment in detail. The lions have moved on, perhaps chased off by the midday heat. The vultures scatter as a handful of habilis approach cautiously, scanning the tall grass for danger. One individual kneels beside the carcass, testing the skin with a flake. The first strike glances off, the second finds purchase. A thin slice of red appears, steam rising faintly into the morning air. Others join, peeling flesh, cracking bones, prying joints apart. Their eyes dart constantly between their work and the surrounding brush. This is no feast of dominance. It's a race against time. Hyenas could arrive at any moment. But for now, the balance holds. The scavengers work quickly, their movements efficient, practiced. They eat when they can, carry off what they can't, and vanish before the danger returns. The evidence of these behaviours lies not just in the tools and bones themselves, but in their arrangement. At Olduvai, archaeologists found sites where animal remains and stone flakes cluster together, what might be called the first activity areas. They suggest that Homo habilis transported both tools and carcass fragments to specific places, perhaps shaded or defensible spots where work could continue safely. This implies foresight and organisation, not random scavenging, but deliberate behaviour. It was survival through planning, through learning the rhythms of predators and knowing how long it took for danger to fade. This ecological role, the opportunistic butcher, was a niche unlike any other. While lions and saber-tooths dominated the kill, habilis occupied the aftermath. It wasn't the top of the food chain, but a new kind of chain altogether, one defined not by dominance but by intelligence, and it worked. By exploiting what others left behind, habilis gained access to nutrition that no herbivore or passive scavenger could match. The Olduvai toolkit was its passport into this hidden economy of remains, where bones became vaults of stored energy. One might imagine this life as miserable, spent lurking in fear behind larger beasts. But to a creature adapted to uncertainty, this pattern was liberation. Scavenging required observation, patience, and timing, qualities that rewarded awareness and memory. It demanded an ability to recognise patterns in the behaviour of other animals, where they hunted, how long they lingered, when it was safe to approach. This awareness, while still instinctive, hinted at a deeper cognitive foundation. The Savanna didn't just feed habilis, it trained it. Every kill site was a classroom in the logic of survival. At some sites, researchers have found long bones split lengthwise with astonishing consistency. These were not random fractures, but targeted strikes to access the inner marrow cavity. The same types of marks recur across regions separated by hundreds of kilometres, suggesting a shared understanding of technique. Even without words, knowledge was spreading. Not through instruction, perhaps, but through imitation and memory. To see another creature extract food in this way was to learn what was possible. The Savanna was a theatre of observation, and Habilis was both audience and actor. Cut marks on ancient bones also tell us something about order, the sequence of behaviour. In several cases, marks appear on areas of bone that would have been stripped of flesh early in the process, such as near muscle attachments. This means Habilis wasn't merely gnawing leftovers, it was removing meat efficiently, sometimes within hours of the kill. A few particularly intriguing finds even suggest that, on occasion, they may have beaten hyenas or vultures to a fresh carcass, not by force but by luck, speed or intuition. These moments would have been dangerous, adrenaline-filled encounters, the edge between boldness and death. And yet, in all likelihood, Habilis never saw itself as bold. It simply followed opportunity. The Savanna teemed with carcasses, and survival belonged to those who could turn them into calories. The difference between an animal that starved and one that thrived might have been a single cut, a single strike of stone against bone. In this sense, Habilis lived by a quiet genius, taking what the world offered and making more of it than nature intended. For modern scientists, one of the most striking things about this period is how consistent these scavenging behaviours remained. For hundreds of thousands of years, Habilis and its kin refined the same strategy, neither innovating wildly nor regressing. Theirs was an equilibrium, a sustainable relationship with the landscape. In that balance lies a kind of wisdom. They didn't overhunt or overconsume. They fit into the ecosystem's margins like shadows among giants. The Serengeti of that time would have been a symphony of violence and silence, of sudden kills followed by slow reclamations. After the predators fed, the scavengers took their turn. Then came the insects, the sun, and finally the soil. Each played a part in recycling life. Homo habilis, though small and fragile, carved out its own verse in that song. It didn't conquer, it endured, and from endurance, evolution would one day build ambition. Even now, when archaeologists pick up an ancient bone and trace those faint, deliberate cut marks, they're touching the earliest signature of human behaviour written in the language of survival. Each groove is a sentence in a story of adaptation, ingenuity, and resilience. It reminds us that our ancestors didn't begin as hunters or conquerors, but as quiet opportunists, creatures who waited for the lions to leave, then stepped into the silence with a stone and a plan. And perhaps that's what made them truly human. Not power, not aggression, but timing. The wisdom to wait, the courage to approach, and the awareness to see that even in the scraps of others, there was enough to live another day. Imagine this. The first light of day spills across the African horizon, seeping into a world that hasn't yet heard a single human word. The air is cool, thin, and heavy with the smell of wet grass and dust. Down in the gorge, shadows stretch long and silent. A few scattered figures stir beneath a low overhang of rock, half hidden among thorny shrubs. The night has passed safely. No roars too close, no eyes glinting from the dark. The small band of Homo habilis is waking. Their world is both beautiful and dangerous, every sunrise an invitation and a test. Dew clings to their hair and skin. The ground is cold underfoot, rough with pebbles, and the faint scent of last night's carcass lingers in the breeze. From the top of the gorge, the first rays of sunlight slide down the red walls, igniting the ochre cliffs and the twisted roots of ancient fig trees. Far below, a thin stream murmurs its way through the valley floor, cutting through layers of ancient ash and fossilized time. This is Olduvai, one of the cradles of the genus Homo, though to its inhabitants it is simply home. The group moves quietly, shaking off the night. A mother with a small child balanced on her hip clambers down from the rocks. Others stretch, scanning the horizon for movement. The grassland beyond the gorge sways in waves of gold and green, its surface alive with motion. Insects rising, birds calling, distant herds of antelope beginning their own migrations. Somewhere out there, predators are waking too. The low cough of a leopard echoes faintly from the acacia trees. Instinct says it's time to move. They descend toward the stream, where smooth stones lie in abundance. A few individuals begin to gather them, fingers curling around shapes already familiar. The sound that follows is soft but deliberate, the clink-clack-clink of stone striking stone. One holds a rounded cobble steady, another strikes it at just the right angle. A shard flies off, then another. A small pile of flakes begins to form, each one sharper than any claw or tooth. The rhythm continues, unhurried but purposeful, echoing faintly through the gorge. It is the morning's first act of creation, repeated countless times across generations. As the light strengthens, their surroundings come alive. Dragonflies skim the water. The air hums with the sound of cicadas. A pair of vultures circle lazily above the open plain, their wings catching the wind. The sight does not go unnoticed. Two members of the group stop their work, following the bird's motion. Where vultures gather, food may wait. The eyes of Homo habilis are trained to read such signals. The landscape speaks, if you know how to listen. But for now, hunger is not yet urgent. They move together toward the grasslands, the small band weaving through tall reeds and dry shrubs. Their movements are cautious but efficient, every step measured, every sound considered. The adults keep to the edges of the open ground, while the younger ones linger near the trees, their hands brushing against bark and leaves as if reassuring themselves that the world is still solid. They carry their tools tucked in palms or tied in rough plant fibre, the edges glinting faintly in the sun. The world they move through is immense. Herds of zebra graze at a distance, their stripes flickering in the haze. Warthogs snort near the roots of a baobab tree. Across the plain, a line of elephants ambles toward a far-off waterhole, their shapes blurred by heat. Each animal follows its rhythm, its cycle of movement and feeding. Homo habilis fits into that rhythm, neither dominant nor defeated, part of the Savanna's choreography of survival. At a fruiting tree, the group pauses. One individual reaches up, testing the branch, pulling down a cluster of figs. The skin is thick and bitter, but inside lies sweet pulp. They share without ceremony. There is no speech to divide, no language to demand. The gesture itself is enough. Around them, the morning light glows warmer, the shadows shortening. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the shriek of a distant cat breaks the stillness. Every head lifts. Silence falls again, long enough for the wind to pass through the grass. Then they move on. The journey across the savannah is not a march. It is a slow, deliberate wandering. They follow the signs of life, fresh tracks in the dust, the scent of water carried on the breeze, the circling of scavengers high above. Each sense, sight, smell, hearing, works in concert, tuned by necessity. Their world is not mapped in geography, but in memory. A fallen tree here, a good shelter there. They remember places by how they felt, safe, dangerous, abundant, or empty. As the sun climbs higher, heat begins to shimmer on the rocks. The gorge behind them fades into shadow, the air above the plains rippling with warmth. Flies buzz louder now, and the scent of decay drifts faintly from somewhere unseen. They slow, eyes narrowing, scanning the horizon. One figure stops and crouches, studying the ground. Hyena tracks, fresh. Nearby, the grass lies flattened in a circular patch, a kill site. The group halts. The leader, if such a word can even apply, moves forward alone, testing the air. A faint smear of blood darkens a stone. They approach quietly, aware that scavenging too soon can mean death. The carcass is old enough to be safe. The lions, it seems, are gone. A few bones remain, some stripped, others cracked. They work quickly now, the smell strong but irresistible. One flake cuts through sinew, another opens a joint. The marrow glistens, pale and soft. A few bites, a few shared fragments, and the group moves on again. The vultures descend after them, finishing what they began. Nothing here is wasted. By midday they find shade beneath a cluster of thorn trees. The gorge lies far behind, and the landscape before them stretches unbroken to the horizon. The world hums with heat. They rest in silence, eyes half closed, chests rising and falling. Flies crawl on their shoulders. One scratches absently at the red dust that coats their skin. The child dozes in its mother's lap. The afternoon passes like this, time measured not in hours but in shadows, the body conserving what little energy it has. Later, when the air begins to cool, they rise again. The light softens into gold. Insects fill the air with a constant living buzz. Across the plain, the herds start to move once more, heading toward water. Homo habilis follows at a distance, careful never to draw attention. Their path is guided by instinct and by memory, the same trails used by generations before. As they approach a shallow stream, the group pauses to drink. The water is muddy but cool. They scoop it up with cupped hands, letting it trickle down their chins. One washes a blood-stained flake, then tests its edge with a thumb. Still sharp, still useful. Evening comes slowly in the gorge country. The sun lowers behind the volcanic hills, turning the sky into a canvas of amber and violet. The calls of night creatures begin. The yipping of jackals, the deep echo of frogs in the marshes. The group finds shelter again among the rocks, choosing a spot high enough to see, but hidden enough to rest. Some climb into the lower branches of a thorn tree, others curl against the stone. There is no fire, no story, only the rhythm of breathing and the pulse of distant life. Above them the stars emerge, bright, uncountable and utterly indifferent. Perhaps one of them looks up, eyes catching the shimmer of light across the sky, and feels something like awareness. Not thought as we know it, but a flicker of recognition. The world is vast and they are small within it, but they belong to it. This is their place, their morning, their day, their night. A day in Olduvai ends as it began, quietly, with survival. The same cycle will repeat tomorrow and the day after, until time itself buries their bones beneath the gorge's red dust. And one day, those bones will whisper to us across millions of years, telling us what dawn once felt like before we had words to describe it. Imagine this: a few small bones lifted carefully from ancient earth, a child's jaw, a handful of finger bones, a scattering of skull fragments so light they could rest in your palm. Yet from these fragile remains we begin to see the outline of a species that stood between two worlds. Around 1,800,000 years ago, in what is now Tanzania's Olduvai Gorge, the bones of a young individual would quietly rewrite the story of what it meant to be human. Scientists would later nickname him Johnny's Child, though his voice never spoke and his bones never grew beyond childhood. What he left behind was not a skeleton of power, but of potential, the earliest known representative of Homo habilis, the so-called handyman. The discovery came to light in the early 1960s, in sediments rich with fossils and the sharp-edged tools that had first sparked curiosity about their makers. Paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey and his team, including Mary and their son Jonathan, were working through the stratified layers of Olduvai when a few key pieces emerged. Fragments of a lower jaw, bits of a skull, and several small bones from the right hand. Individually they were modest, Together they formed a portrait of something neither fully ape nor fully human. The jaw was narrower and more delicate than that of earlier Australopithecines. The teeth were smaller, the brain case slightly more rounded, and when the pieces were measured, the capacity of the skull was estimated to hold about 680 cubic centimetres of brain, nearly 50% larger than a chimpanzee's, and substantially more than any Australopithecine known at the time. For the first time, the fossil record hinted at a brain on the threshold of something new. The partial skeleton, officially catalogued as Olduvai hominid 7, or OH7, became the type specimen for Homo habilis. Though it belonged to a child, the remains revealed proportions and features that could only have come from a species distinct from its tree-climbing ancestors. The hands, for instance, were unlike those of any ape. The fingers were curved, suggesting a lingering ability to grasp branches, but the thumb was strikingly human, broad, opposable, and capable of precise movement. The wrist bones allowed for a fine range of rotation, meaning this young individual could hold and manipulate objects with intention, not merely grasp them. In those small bones lay the anatomical foundation for every tool, instrument, and gesture that would follow across millions of years. When the discovery was announced in 1964, the scientific world divided. Some argued that these fossils represented a transitional form of Australopithecine rather than a new human lineage. Others saw in them the clear evidence of the first true member of our genus, the creature who bridged instinct and invention. The Leakeys insisted that the combination of a larger brain and refined hand dexterity marked a qualitative leap, and history, it seems, has largely agreed. Homo habilis earned its name for the capabilities implied by its anatomy, habilis, meaning handy or skilled. But OH7 was just the beginning. Over the decades that followed, other fragments surfaced from different corners of East Africa, each adding new brushstrokes to the portrait. One of the most puzzling was a set of fossils known as OH62, found in 1986. This specimen included parts of an arm, leg, and shoulder belonging to an adult. When scientists first examined it, they were struck by a surprising proportion. The arms were significantly longer than the legs, more akin to an ape's build than a modern human's. This contradicted earlier assumptions that Homo habilis had already achieved fully human limb ratios. The revelation was humbling. It meant that even as the brain and hands advanced, the body still carried echoes of the trees. This species, though increasingly terrestrial, had not yet abandoned the safety of climbing. Taken together, these fossils painted a complex picture, a creature of dual worlds. The head and hands told one story: precision, curiosity, and expanding intelligence. The limbs told another: adaptation, caution, a body still built for both the forest and the plain. Homo habilis was not yet the confident long-distance walker its descendants would become. Its legs were short, its stride limited, but its posture upright. It walked when it could, climbed when it had to, and thought its way through everything in between. Every new bone adds a paragraph to this biography of the unknown. The skull fragments reveal clues about muscle attachment, smaller jaw muscles than earlier hominins, suggesting less reliance on sheer bite strength and more on tool use for processing food. The teeth, flatter and less specialized, speak to a flexible diet. The inner structure of the hand bones, studied through micro-CT scanning, shows reinforced ridges that absorb the stress of repeated tool striking. Even the curve of the spine hints at balance, an adjustment to life on 2 feet rather than 4. In the quiet of the laboratory, each fragment is examined like a line of ancient code. The fossilized jaw of OH7, for instance, preserves the subtle tilt of a chin that isn't quite human but is already evolving toward it. The cranial pieces reveal a gentle dome shape, a sign that the brain beneath was beginning to reorganize. The grooves and sutures across its surface tell of growth patterns, of neural expansion that demanded more skull to contain it. When scientists reconstruct the face, the result is hauntingly familiar. Forward-facing eyes, a shorter snout, and a mouth framed by smaller teeth. It is a face still primitive but already thoughtful. We must remember, though, that Homo habilis is known from only a handful of individuals, scattered fragments spanning perhaps 500,000 years of time. The species is, in a sense, a hypothesis held together by bones and inference. What we see is a mosaic of traits rather than a complete form. And yet, that mosaic reveals something profound. The moment evolution began shaping bodies for thought. The hands that struck stone had already begun reshaping the mind, and the mind, in turn, would reshape the hand. For paleoanthropologists, there is something deeply personal about these finds. Each bone emerges from the sediment like a message written to the future, waiting for translation. The archaeologist's brush, the lab technician's magnifier, the anatomist's caliper, all become extensions of curiosity that bridges eons. When the small skull fragments of OH7 were first fitted together, Louis Leakey is said to have fallen silent for a long moment. Before him lay not a complete skull, but a threshold, proof that the line between ape and human was not a sudden leap, but a slow, intricate climb. Other discoveries since have supported this image. At Kubifora in Kenya, fossils attributed to Homo habilis display similar cranial capacities and delicate jaws. The variations between individuals suggest a species in flux, experimenting with body form, testing adaptations. Even within its small population, habilis seems to embody the evolutionary trial and error that defines our lineage. Some specimens hint at larger frames, others at smaller, more gracile builds, each as a version of possibility. The irony, of course, is that it was a child's fossil, not an adult's, that first revealed just how grown up this species had become. The hands of Johnny's child were small, the jaw still developing, but the brain case was already far ahead of any ape's trajectory. The intelligence encoded within those bones had begun to outpace their size. Evolution, it seems, was investing in cognition even before the body caught up. Standing today at the edge of Olduvai Gorge, it's difficult not to imagine that small figure, curious, dexterous, living in a world vast and indifferent, and to feel the weight of connection. Those bones, calcified and silent, contain the geometry of our own hands, the curve of our skulls, the first drafts of our species' story. We are quite literally the continuation of that experiment. The difference is only of degree, not kind. From a few scattered fossils we reconstruct not just anatomy, but presence. The long arms remind us of caution, the short legs of endurance, the fine hands of imagination. Together they whisper of a being aware enough to act, and fragile enough to fail. Homo habilis stands as the earliest version of ourselves that we can still recognise, curious, adaptive, and unfinished. And perhaps that's the most human thing of all, to be unfinished, to always be becoming. From a child's hand bone to the tools of modern science, the thread remains unbroken, a 2 million-year conversation written in the language of bone. Imagine this, a small child no older than 3, sitting in the dust beneath a tree on the edge of the savannah, watching an adult strike stone against stone. Each blow sends sparks of sound into the air, sharp and rhythmic, echoing against the gorge walls. The child blinks, eyes wide, tracking every movement. The adult pauses, picks up a flake, tests the edge against a thumb, then offers it forward. The child hesitates, then reaches out. No words are exchanged, no language, no explanation, just patience, imitation, and the silent inheritance of survival. This moment, fragile and unrecorded, may have been one of the first sparks of something entirely new. Teaching, sharing, the beginnings of what we now call family. By 1,800,000 years ago, Homo habilis had already begun to live in a world that demanded cooperation. They were small, vulnerable, and surrounded by larger predators that ruled the open plains. To survive, they needed each other. Fossils don't preserve behaviour, but the clues left in bones and brain size suggest that these early humans could no longer live as isolated individuals. Their brains were growing, their young were slower to mature, and their world was more dangerous than ever. To raise a helpless infant, to protect a child who could not yet run or climb, required something evolution had not asked of apes before: trust. Among our primate relatives, mothers carry their infants constantly. A baby chimpanzee can cling tightly to its mother's fur from the day it is born, riding through the forest as she forages. But for Homo habilis, the shift to a more terrestrial life changed everything. Walking upright freed the hands for tools, but it made carrying a child far more complicated. The body of the habilis mother was built for movement across the ground, not for balancing an infant while scaling a tree. The forest that once offered safety had thinned into open savanna. There was no place to hide except among one another. The mother could no longer do it alone, so others began to help. Perhaps it started simply: another female taking a turn holding the infant, an older sibling bringing food, a watchful companion alerting the group to danger. These were not conscious acts of kindness as we understand them. They were behaviours rewarded by survival. A child raised by many hands had a better chance of living long enough to pass on those cooperative instincts. Over time, these patterns became embedded, not as moral choices but as instinctive strategies. The first village was not made of huts, but of shared responsibility. When we imagine habilis bands moving across the grasslands, we can almost see it. 5 or 6 individuals travelling together, some carrying tools, others watching the young. Their gestures, glances, and proximity tell a story no fossil can. They probably communicated through touch, posture, and sound, the same pre-linguistic signals still used by apes today. But unlike apes, their cooperation wasn't limited to grooming or food theft. It was purposeful. They relied on one another to survive each day's journey through the shifting light of Africa. The archaeological record gives us no campfire scenes, no shared meals preserved in ash, but we know from anatomy that their children would have required long care. With brain sizes between 500 and 800 cubic centimetres, Homo habilis infants were born underdeveloped, their heads growing slowly over years. That prolonged dependence meant the species had to invent new kinds of social structure, subtle, invisible inventions that never fossilized. To feed and protect those young, the group itself had to adapt as much as the body did. It's easy to underestimate what that meant. Caring for another being that isn't your own offspring demands empathy, the ability to sense another's needs and respond. It also demands memory and foresight, remembering which child belongs to whom, which paths lead to water, which tree fruits ripen first. Every act of sharing food or teaching a task required small leaps of understanding, fragments of what would one day become human consciousness. Imagine the scene again at the edge of Olduvai Gorge. The day is hot now, the light white and unrelenting. A group of adults sits in the shade, scraping meat from bone, cracking it for marrow. A child sits nearby, imitating motions with a dull pebble. Another toddler reaches for food and is gently pushed away by a patient hand. Nearby, a mother nurses watching the horizon. An elder dozes, her skin lined and pale with dust. Around them, the savanna hums, distant herds, insect wings, the ever-present smell of life and decay. It's an ordinary day, yet in every gesture there is the echo of humanity's beginning. Cooperation without words, culture before civilization. Scientists sometimes call this kind of behaviour alloparenting, meaning child-rearing by individuals other than the mother. Among modern humans, this pattern defines our species. Among habilis, it might have been born out of necessity. The simple act of sharing care, feeding, carrying, or guarding another's young, could have changed the emotional wiring of the brain. Those who felt comfort in connection would survive more often than those who did not. In time, natural selection may have begun to favour individuals who sought contact, empathy, and reassurance from others. The social mind was forming, one shared burden at a time. And then there is the question of teaching. Toolmaking, even at the older one level, is not intuitive. It requires observation and repetition. The difference between a good flake and a wasted strike lies in angle and pressure, skills that take practice to learn. Without words, this teaching must have happened through demonstration. An experienced maker would chip stone while others watched, then allow them to try. Mistakes would have been common, fingers cut, stones shattered. Yet over time, knowledge spread. Teaching became a form of inheritance, more enduring than genes. It was the first education system, a circle of bodies, a rhythm of clinking stone, a silence filled with intent. When we look at the fossilized hand bones of Homo habilis, we see the mechanical precision of this act, the thickened thumbs, the strong tendons anchoring to the wrist, the subtle ridges where muscles once pulled against bone. But what we cannot see is the invisible choreography that made it possible, the watching, waiting, and repeating that pass skill from one generation to the next. The making of tools was also the making of minds, and perhaps of hearts. Social cooperation did more than ensure survival. It began to create memory. To help another, you had to recall them. To teach, you had to notice their progress. These acts required not just intelligence, but continuity, a recognition that what happens today affects tomorrow. The longer lifespan of habilis compared to earlier apes gave them the time to form such continuity. The old could observe, guide, and protect. The young could learn not just by instinct, but by imitation. Each generation built, however slightly, on the lessons of the last. Somewhere in this slow unfolding, emotional bonds took root, not the complex attachments of modern families, but early versions of affection, loyalty, and grief. A mother who lost her child might linger near the body longer than necessary, an echo of recognition that something precious was gone. A companion might remain close to another during illness, sharing warmth or watchfulness. These behaviours, once adaptive, became the seeds of compassion. They did not require awareness of mortality or morality, only the instinct to care. If we could step back in time and observe such a group for a day, the scene would seem both alien and heartbreakingly familiar. Their faces, their sounds, their movements would echo the rhythms of all social creatures: cooperation, conflict, comfort, reconciliation. The same impulses that shape a modern family's breakfast table, the give and take, the glances of reassurance, may have begun as survival strategies among the band of handy humans at Olduvai. No fossil records these moments. The sediment preserves the bones, not the bonds, but we can infer from the evidence of anatomy, from the logic of survival, and from the traces of tools that the species could not have thrived without some form of shared life. And if Homo habilis shared care, shared food, and shared knowledge, then something deeply human was already stirring. Not just the making of tools, but the making of one another. Perhaps the greatest invention of Homo habilis was not the flake or the hammerstone, but the circle. The gathering of bodies and minds around a common task, a common fire that did not yet burn but already existed in spirit. The first family was not a pair, but a group, not built by words but by watching, touching, enduring. From those circles came every society that followed. From that simple act of staying together came civilization itself. Imagine this. The sun has dropped low over the savannah, and a small group of Homo habilis huddles near the carcass of a zebra. The air hums with flies, the smell of blood thick and heavy. One individual gestures sharply toward the horizon, a warning. Another responds with a quick low sound, half growl, half word. The group freezes, listening. A leopard's cough echoes faintly through the tall grass. No one writes this down. No one needs to. Whatever those sounds mean, everyone understands. 2 million years before the first alphabet, the first communication already worked. It didn't tell stories. it saved lives. For most of human prehistory, words were not about poetry or philosophy. They were about survival. The early members of our genus, especially Homo habilis, the handy human, lived in a world that demanded fast, clear signals. Danger near the waterhole, food found under the acacia, a baby in trouble, a vulture overhead. To live together required not only cooperation but coordination, and coordination requires communication. The question is how far those first voices could go. The fossils cannot answer this directly. No vocal cords survive, no parchment records a thought. But the clues lie in what Homo habilis could do. Their brains were larger than those of earlier Australopithecines, somewhere between 500 and 800 cubic centimetres, enough to process patterns, remember sequences, and perhaps link sound to meaning. Their tools were deliberate, not random. Olduvai flakes were shaped with intention, each blow building on the last. That kind of planning demands not only thought, but the ability to share it. When one individual learned how to strike at just the right angle, that knowledge had to move from one mind to another. Whether by sound, gesture, or both, that transfer was communication in its earliest recognizable form. Modern great apes already give us a window into what might have been possible. Chimpanzees use more than 60 distinct vocalizations, from food calls to specific alarm cries. Some researchers have shown that these calls are not just emotional outbursts but structured signals. A distinct call for snakes, another for eagles, another for discovering ripe fruit. Bonobos even combine sounds in rudimentary sequences, altering meaning by context. If these close relatives of ours can do this without the brain power of early humans, then Homo habilis almost certainly went further. Their world was louder with meaning than we imagine. Picture an early evening scene at Olduvai Gorge. A group gathers near a shallow stream after scavenging. One individual points toward the distant ridge where vultures spiral in the sky. A short, repetitive sound follows, something like kaka, echoed by another. They begin to move together, understanding the cue. Food there. It's not language as we know it, but it's more than noise. Over generations, these calls and gestures would have gained subtlety. A tone to show urgency, a rhythm to mark distance, a gesture to add direction. Each innovation stitched the group tighter together, one sound at a time. Anthropologists have often debated when true language began, but that debate can distract from the continuity. The beginnings were not sudden. They were built across countless small moments of shared attention. One individual looking where another pointed, responding to a call, predicting behaviour based on tone. In that sense, communication is far older than speech. The handy human may have been the first to bring intention into sound, linking what was seen, felt, or feared with something that could be transmitted. There's a reason many scholars connect the evolution of toolmaking and the evolution of communication. To make a tool is to plan. To teach it, you need to guide another through steps. You might not have words for sharp or edge, but you can make a sound of approval when a flake forms correctly or a low grunt when it fails. Through repetition, meaning takes shape. The act of knapping stone, rhythmic, precise, and social, may have been the earliest classroom. Every clink of rock echoed the tempo of thought itself, and this had deeper consequences. Communication builds memory, and memory builds culture. Once you can share an idea, even a simple one, it can outlive the moment. A sound for honey, or river, or cat creates a shared mental map. Over time, such sounds become a form of invisible technology, a way to shape behaviour without shaping stone. This may be why some researchers call communication the first soft technology, the invention of cooperation itself. We cannot reconstruct the first word, but we can guess its purpose. It was not love, nor why, nor even yes, it was almost certainly look, a single urgent syllable pulling attention toward danger or discovery. From that one act, the alignment of minds through sound, everything else would one day follow. teaching, storytelling, prayer. Before speech became art, it was awareness shared. The structure of the Homo habilis brain also offers subtle hints. Endocasts, internal impressions of fossil skulls, suggest an expansion in regions associated with coordination, vision, and possibly auditory processing. These were not silent creatures. Their faces were flatter than apes, their vocal tract slightly reshaped, and their breath control improving through changes in posture. They might have had the ability to modulate pitch or rhythm in ways no ape could. A call that once meant threat could now vary to mean big threat, near threat, or threat gone. The emotional range of their voices may have expanded alongside the cognitive range of their minds. Still, we must be cautious. There is no evidence that Homo habilis possessed syntax or grammar. Their communication was likely grounded in context and sound, not abstraction. It would have been tied to the immediate, here, now, this. Yet even that was revolutionary. Once communication moves beyond emotion to information, evolution begins to favour those who can use it best. Those who could signal danger precisely survived more often than those who could not. Those who could coordinate scavenging or toolmaking through shared cues fed their young more reliably. Every generation born into a world with more structured sound inherited not just genes, but a richer auditory environment to learn from. Some paleoanthropologists have even speculated cautiously that Homo habilis may have used proto-words, single, context-based sounds repeated within groups and passed across generations. The vocabulary might have been small, perhaps a dozen or two meaningful noises, each carrying nuance through tone and rhythm. A sound for come, another for stay, a short burst for food, a longer one for danger. It's not hard to imagine how quickly such a system could expand. Once two individuals agree on meaning, a world of possibility opens, and meaning has a peculiar property: it multiplies. Every time Homo habilis pointed, called, or repeated a familiar sound, they were not only sharing information but reinforcing memory. The group became a living network of linked minds, each echoing the others. This was the first whisper of culture, not written or sung but spoken into the air and carried by breath. Modern primatologists often describe the moment when a chimpanzee teaches another to crack nuts, or use a stick as cultural transmission. The act is brief but profound, knowledge moving across individuals without genetic inheritance. Homo habilis may have achieved this far more efficiently through a growing web of sound and gesture. Teaching, warning, comforting. These were the first uses of language, not persuasion or art. And yet, even without full speech, these early humans might have begun to experience something new: collective memory. The ability to share not only what one sees but what one remembers. A toolmaker could recall yesterday's river crossing, the spot where they found an antelope's remains, and convey that memory through sound. In doing so, they expanded the group's awareness beyond the present moment. Time itself began to open up in their minds. As dusk fell on the African plains, the first conversations of humanity might have been happening not in words but in patterns, the tempo of reassurance, the rhythm of warning, the call and response of belonging. Each sound was a survival code but also a connection. The line between communication and compassion blurred. To speak even simply was to care that another understood. We often define humanity by language, but perhaps it's more accurate to say that language defines humanity, that the first words, however crude, created the first truly shared world. In those grunts, calls, and gestures lay the earliest wisdom of our kind, that survival depends not only on strength or skill, but on understanding. No dictionary records what Homo habilis said, but if we listen carefully to the rhythm of our own speech, the urgency in warning, the softness in comfort, the repetition in teaching, we can still hear them. The first words were not about knowing, they were about noticing together. Imagine this. A band of early humans crouches low in the tall grass, their small bodies hidden by shadow and dust. In the distance, a group of antelope graze, their ears flicking in perfect rhythm to the sounds of danger. The wind shifts. A single stone clinks against another. In an instant, the herd explodes into motion, thunder on the plains, and the would-be hunters of Olduvai are left clutching their pebbles, watching their dinner vanish in a cloud of dust. This, perhaps, was the story more often than not for Homo habilis. They were clever, determined, and quick to exploit opportunity, but they were not yet the dominant hunters of Africa. They were survivors in a land where every meal was someone else's leftovers. To call them hunters at all might be generous. No spears, no throwing tools, no projectile weapons have ever been found from their time. The archaeological record of 1,800,000 years ago shows chipped stone flakes and hammerstones, instruments ideal for cutting, scraping and breaking open bones, but not for bringing down a moving target. Their bodies tell the same story: small stature, long arms, and relatively weak frames. An adult Homo habilis stood perhaps just over a metre tall and weighed around 30 kilograms, roughly the size of a modern 10-year-old child. Against the lions, saber-toothed cats, and hyenas of their world, this species occupied a fragile niche. Yet, somehow, they endured. The key to their survival may have been flexibility. While they were certainly not top predators, evidence suggests they were opportunistic omnivores, capable of scavenging from carcasses, but also willing to take small prey when the chance presented itself. The landscape of East Africa during this time was rich but perilous. Herds of zebra, antelope and wildebeest roamed the plains, leaving behind plenty of scraps for those bold or patient enough to claim them. Fossilized bones from ancient riverbeds often show both cut marks and tooth marks, with the sequence telling a familiar story. The deep punctures of carnivore teeth appear first, followed by the finer parallel cuts of stone blades. The hominins arrived late to the feast, but they made the most of it. Still, to reduce Homo habilis entirely to scavengers may oversimplify the picture. Even in the modern world, primates display remarkable ingenuity in finding and capturing food. Baboons and chimpanzees, for instance, have been observed coordinating ambushes on small animals, or snatching newborns from nests with terrifying speed. If apes can hunt when opportunity arises, then surely the handy human, with sharper tools and keener brains, could do the same. It's easy to imagine them stalking through reeds beside a shrinking waterhole, spotting a stranded turtle or an injured gazelle fawn. A quick rush, a blow with a stone, and a small victory in a world that rarely offered them one. These acts wouldn't have been hunting as we think of it. No strategy, no long pursuit, no planned ambush of big game, but rather bursts of instinct sharpened by experience. In this sense, they were less predators than pragmatic foragers. If the chance came to kill, they took it. If not, they scavenged. This dual strategy might have been the true secret of their survival. Unlike the specialized carnivores around them, Homo habilis could live off almost anything. Marrow from bones, grubs from rotting logs, fruits, roots, nuts, even discarded scraps from lions and leopards. Evolution favours those who can eat anything, and habilis, quite literally, made a meal of adaptability. But there's something deeply telling about the cut mark evidence found on ancient bones. In many cases, the marks occur on areas of the skeleton that large predators had already stripped clean. This means Homo habilis wasn't competing for the tender meat, but rather for what came after. The hidden calories within bone and connective tissue. To access that treasure, they needed both knowledge and tools. A hammerstone could shatter the thick femur of a zebra, releasing marrow rich in fat, a rare high-energy prize. In that moment, a handful of small hominins with simple stones could outwit even the mightiest cat. They might not have hunted the animal, but they had mastered the art of second chances. Archaeologists have debated for decades whether habilis ever truly crossed the line into active predation. The lack of spears doesn't necessarily prove they never hunted, but it does limit the scale. They could not have taken down adult antelopes or wildebeests without being trampled or torn apart. Yet smaller animals, lizards, hares, ground birds, tortoises, were well within reach. In fact, shell fragments and small bone remains from some early Pleistocene sites hint at exactly this: opportunistic captures of slow-moving or trapped prey. The ancient equivalent of fast food, as some scientists have joked, might have been a turtle cracked open with a rock. Even such modest successes could have shaped behaviour. To kill, one must anticipate, move quietly, plan the strike, rid movement in the grass. Each attempt, successful or not, honed the mind for pattern recognition and coordination. The transition from pure scavenger to occasional hunter was not about power, but about cognition. It was about learning to see opportunity where others saw chaos. The ecology of their world made this mentality essential. The savannas and open woodlands of East Africa were dynamic, unstable places. Droughts could dry rivers overnight. Herds could vanish for months. The ability to adapt, to shift from plants to meat, from scavenging to hunting, from passive waiting to sudden action, would have separated the survivors from the doomed. Homo habilis was not built to dominate the savanna, but to navigate it like a gambler playing odds. We might imagine a small group creeping along the edge of a dry gully, following the scent of decay. They find a carcass already stripped by lions, but one leg remains thick and heavy. A few sharp flakes later, the marrow is theirs. Later that same day, a lizard darts from under a rock, and one quick hand slams down a stone. These small victories might not sound heroic, but multiplied across generations, they add up to resilience. And resilience, not conquest, was the first great success of the human lineage. If habilis ever organised for a kill, it would have been spontaneous, instinctual, and deeply communal. The same cooperative tendencies that help them care for young or teach toolmaking could easily extend to food gathering. A handful of adults working together could corner small prey, while others guarded against predators. The ability to communicate, through gestures, vocal calls, or shared focus, would have made these moments possible. Hunting, then, was as much about teamwork as it was about violence. In a way, they were both hunters and hunted, participants in the grand ecology of survival. They shared the plains with saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, and packs of wild dogs. Even as they scavenged from these predators, they themselves were targets. Every approach to a carcass carried a risk. Every meal could end in ambush. The act of feeding demanded courage. When you live at the bottom of the food chain, survival itself is an act of defiance. Over time, this balancing act between hunter and scavenger shaped not only behaviour but identity. Caution became a virtue. Observation became instinct. Patience, waiting for a predator to finish, waiting for the vultures to disperse, became strategy. These psychological adaptations would one day set the stage for more sophisticated forms of hunting among their descendants. But for Homo habilis, survival was still a daily negotiation with fear. They had not yet conquered their world. They were learning to coexist with it. To modernise, it's tempting to view them as primitive or incomplete. But there is dignity in what they achieved. With nothing but stones, curiosity and cooperation, they managed to carve out a living in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They didn't need dominance to matter, they just needed endurance. If there's one lesson Homo habilis left written in the bones they cut and cracked, it's this. Mastery does not always mean control. Sometimes it means adaptation. Sometimes it means knowing when to strike and when to wait. Imagine this. Dusk settles across the savanna, and the air begins to cool. In the distance, thunder murmurs beyond the mountains, but closer, much closer, another sound moves through the tall grass. A rustle, a low growl, a sudden silence. A small group of Homo habilis huddles in a hollow between rocks, pressing close together as the light drains from the world. Their tools are nearby, scattered like fragile hope. Sharp stones, flakes, a cracked femur that still smells faintly of marrow. But none of these can protect them now. The first toolmakers, clever as they were, lived in a world ruled by things faster, stronger, and hungrier. And when darkness fell, they were not the hunters anymore. For decades, archaeologists imagined Homo habilis as the confident survivor of the early Pleistocene, the handy human, clever enough to carve out a living among beasts. Yet beneath that optimism lay another truth. They were not just part of the ecosystem, they were part of the menu. The bones tell this story more honestly than any myth. In the sediments of Olduvai Gorge, scientists found fragments of a skull and jaw belonging to one of these early humans, their surfaces marked by twin puncture wounds, perfectly spaced, deeply indented, and unmistakable, the calling card of a leopard. The fossil was the very same specimen once celebrated as proof of our ingenuity. OH7, Johnny's child, the type specimen of Homo habilis. The first representative of our genus, it turns out, was likely killed and eaten. When researchers examined the remains in detail, they noticed something unsettling. The holes were not random gouges or weathered damage, but precise symmetrical perforations, the upper canines of a big cat driving through soft skull bone. Later analyses, using digital imaging and forensic modelling, confirmed the match almost exactly to modern leopard dentition. A predator had sunk its teeth into the child's head, lifted it from the ground and carried it away, perhaps into a nearby tree. There, in the branches, the bones would have been picked clean, dropped one by one onto the ground below. The scene might have lasted only minutes, but the echo of it carried through nearly 2 million years. This was not an isolated case. Other fossils from the same region, jaws, limb bones, even skull caps, show similar puncture marks, many aligned in pairs that fit the jaws of ancient cats. One adult Homo habilis specimen revealed matching holes at the back of the skull, perfectly placed for a killing bite from above. Another showed signs of being dragged before dismemberment. In several cases, bones from the same layer bear both cut marks from stone tools and tooth marks from predators, implying that the line between hunter and prey blurred daily. They scavenged from lions, and lions scavenged from them. The Savanna was an economy of risk, and the cost of failure was steep. What emerges from this evidence is not a picture of dominance, but of endurance. Homo habilis lived in a perpetual twilight of fear and resourcefulness. They were tool makers, but not yet warriors. They had intelligence, but not power. In daylight, they might wield their stones and scavenge the remains of a zebra. But at night, their world belonged to others. Leopards with patient eyes, saber-toothed cats with jaws built for bone, hyenas whose laughter haunted the grasslands. Without fire, without shelters or weapons beyond a stone, habilis likely sought refuge in the only protection available, the trees. Imagine the moment just after sunset. The group gathers what they can, scraps of meat, stones, the youngest among them. They climb into a low acacia or onto a rock face overlooking the plain. Below, the dark comes alive. The rustling never stops. A shape moves among the shadows, its coat blending perfectly with the grass. The sound of breath, slow and deliberate, circles the base of the tree. The night is long, and every sound carries meaning. The snap of a twig, the crunch of bone, the whisper of fur through grass. Somewhere nearby, a leopard feeds on one of their own. They can do nothing but listen. Scientists studying predator-prey dynamics from that era describe Homo habilis as a secondary consumer, a technical way of saying that they ate meat, but were also eaten. This was a time when predation pressure shaped evolution as surely as climate or diet. Survival wasn't guaranteed by strength, but by awareness. The nervous systems of our ancestors were forged in these long sleepless nights. The vigilance that defines us, the sensitivity to movement, the instinct to fear glowing eyes in the dark, may trace its roots to this epoch, when our kind learned that danger could come silently from anywhere. Fossil evidence even suggests that some big cats specialized in hunting primates. Leopards today are known for their ability to stalk silently, ambush swiftly, and carry their kills into trees. Ancient leopards of the early Pleistocene likely behaved the same way. Their agility and stealth made them perfect primate predators. One forensic study compared the bite marks on habilis skulls to the feeding behaviour of modern leopards and found striking similarities. The angle of the bite, the puncture depth, even the pattern of skull fractures. These animals didn't just scavenge human remains, they hunted them. There's a haunting symmetry in that discovery. The same trees that sheltered habilis also became the killing grounds where their bodies were stored. The same cliffs that offered vantage points by day became traps by night. The landscape gave and took in equal measure. Every adaptation, walking upright, using tools, venturing into open ground, came with new dangers. To step out of the forest was to step into the spotlight of predators who had ruled the plains for millennia. One can almost see it, the moment of the hunt. The leopard waits, motionless, its golden fur indistinguishable from the tall grass. The band of habilis moves cautiously, unaware that eyes follow them. The cat's tail flicks once, then silence breaks into chaos. The burst, the chase, the scream cut short. The rest of the group scatters, climbing, calling, helpless to intervene. Later they find nothing but a few bones and a familiar shape in the dirt. Fear, memory and mourning blur into something deeper. Recognition. They have lost one of their own. Perhaps for the first time they begin to understand that the world can take without warning. It's easy to look back from our vantage point and imagine that intelligence alone could have saved them. But cleverness without defence only buys time. What habilis had was not dominance but adaptability, an ability to read danger and retreat, to learn from loss. In the long arc of evolution, these instincts mattered more than size or speed. They created a mind wired for vigilance, one that could foresee threat and remember pain. In a sense, fear itself became our first inheritance. Some paleoanthropologists suggest that the constant threat of predation may have accelerated social cohesion and communication. When the night belonged to predators, survival depended on coordination, sleeping close, listening for warning sounds, protecting the vulnerable. In that darkness, the first gestures of care may have formed. A touch to reassure, a call to warn, a moment of quiet watchfulness shared between individuals. The fear of being hunted might have been the catalyst that drew us closer together. By morning, the savannah would have looked calm again. The wind would scatter the last tufts of fur, the vultures would descend, and the cycle would continue. To live in such a world was to live with humility. For all their ingenuity, Homo habilis remained part of nature's balance, neither above nor apart from it. They were makers of tools, yes, but also reminders that no invention could outpace evolution overnight. The first humans were not masters of the world, but apprentices learning its rules the hard way. And so the story of habilis is not just one of innovation, but of endurance through fear. Each sunset carried the same quiet question. Would the night pass safely? And though most of their world has vanished, that question still lingers in us. When we flinch at a sound in the dark, when we feel unease beneath an open sky, we are echoing memories far older than civilization, memories of a time when the dark truly belonged to something else. Imagine this. The last light bleeds away from the savannah, and the horizon fades from gold to black. The wind cools, the insects grow louder, and somewhere far off a lion begins to roar. There is no firelight, no warmth, no glow to mark a boundary between safety and the night. A small group of Homo habilis crouches in silence, pressed together on a rocky ledge or in the fork of a tree. The darkness is absolute. Eyes strain, ears twitch, hearts beat too fast. Every sound carries meaning. A snapping twig could be the wind, or teeth approaching through the tall grass. In this world, the night itself is alive. For Homo habilis, every sunset was a gamble. When the sun dipped below the horizon 2 million years ago, it took with it the only real protection they had. The day was their domain. They could scavenge, explore, and use their tools under the open light. But at night, everything shifted. The predators who had slept in the heat, lions, leopards, saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, stirred from their resting places. To survive meant withdrawing, finding height or cover, and trusting that instinct and luck would be enough. Fire, that ancient symbol of control, was still a distant dream. Archaeology tells us that no hearth, no ash, no burned bone belongs to this time. The earliest clear traces of controlled fire appear hundreds of thousands of years later, long after Homo habilis had vanished. What that means is staggering. For hundreds of millennia, our ancestors lived as daylight beings in a world that turned against them each night. They knew flame only as something far away. Lightning striking dry grass, distant wildfires devouring the horizon, glowing coals glimpsed and feared, not mastered. To imagine the courage required to fall asleep in that world is to glimpse the true fragility of early humanity. When darkness fell, the landscape transformed. The same open plain that seemed limitless under the sun became an ocean of sound and scent. The grass whispered with hidden movement. The calls of nightjars and jackals blended with the deep rhythmic panting of big cats on the prowl. The air grew colder, heavier. For Homo habilis, whose small frames offered little insulation, the chill could kill as efficiently as claws. Their bodies pressed close together, the warmth of others their only shield. The huddled form, what we now associate with comfort, may have first been born in fear. Paleoanthropologists have long speculated how these early humans chose their sleeping spots. Caves were rare in their environment, and many would have been already occupied by leopards or hyenas. More likely they sought natural shelters, clusters of boulders, dry riverbeds with narrow entryways, or low trees with sturdy branches. Their long arms, inherited from their climbing ancestors, were not yet obsolete. Climbing a tree before dusk could mean the difference between seeing sunrise or becoming part of someone else's meal. In that sense, Homo habilis was still living between worlds, too human to belong to the forest, too vulnerable to own the plains. Even in sleep they could never truly rest. The night demanded vigilance. Perhaps one or two adults stayed half awake, listening for sounds while others dozed fitfully. The idea of a watch may have begun here, not as an invention, but as necessity. Evolution would have favoured light sleepers, those whose ears caught the faintest shift in the wind. It is no accident that humans today still wake so easily to sound. That reflects maybe an echo of 1,000,000 nights before fire. Without light, time stretched strangely. The moon, when it rose, cast pale shadows and cruel deceptions. Eyeshine glimmered in the distance, sometimes antelope, sometimes something else. To move in that world required a new kind of awareness, not sight, but memory, intuition, imagination. They learned to map the landscape in their minds, to recall where the thorn tree stood, where the rocks made safe perches. They learned the smell of safety and the rhythm of dawn. Each successful morning reinforced that knowledge. This place keeps us alive. That one does not. Survival became a ritual of remembering. One can almost picture a typical night in that ancient gorge. A few individuals settle into a natural hollow beneath a leaning tree. the ground still warm from the sun. They press together, sharing quiet breaths. Somewhere nearby, a mother cradles her child, humming softly, perhaps not words, but a rhythmic reassurance. The darkness hums with danger, but also with presence. Stars fill the sky, unfamiliar and infinite. The Milky Way burns cold above the plains, a river of light that offers no heat, no comfort, only mystery. The first astronomers, though they had no names for the stars, might have stared upward and felt the same pull we still feel, the need to understand what lies beyond the black. The absence of fire didn't just define their nights, it defined their minds. Fear in the dark was not just a weakness, it was a teacher. It sharpened attention, strengthened memory, and bound the group together. Every creak of wood or rustle of leaves forced them to listen, to learn patterns, to anticipate. The instinct to stay near others, to sleep in clusters, may have evolved as much from nights like these as from the day's challenges. The bond of safety, shared warmth, shared fear, was as vital as food. Some researchers have suggested that these nocturnal struggles may have accelerated social and cognitive development. When vision failed, hearing, touch, and cooperation became essential. Maybe they developed simple vocal signals, soft clicks or hums, to reassure each other in the dark. Perhaps a faint whistle warned of movement. These were not yet words, but the seeds of communication were sown in silence. The darkness demanded not just endurance, but connection. And then, every so often, the darkness lit up. A wildfire born of lightning-striking dry grass would sweep across the plains, glowing red against the night. From a distance, Homo habilis would have seen it, a wall of light devouring the horizon. They would have smelled the smoke, heard the crackle, and felt both awe and terror. That glow must have burned itself into their memory, a strange, living thing that could both kill and protect. Perhaps some dared to approach the cooling embers the next day, to feel the warmth and smell the charred earth. They did not yet know how to control it, but they knew it existed, and that knowledge might have haunted them as much as it inspired their descendants. In the millennia before fire, survival at night depended on rhythm and instinct. They likely developed habitual routes, safe paths between water and shelter, timed to daylight. The mind of Homo habilis would have run on cycles of light and dark, safety and peril. The concept of home, if it existed at all, was probably born from this contrast. A place not just to eat or sleep, but to survive the night. Morning was deliverance. As the first light crept over the horizon, the shapes of trees and stones reappeared, and the sounds of predators faded. Every sunrise was a victory, proof that they had endured. The group would stir slowly, stretching, blinking against the glare, reclaiming the day. The world they re-entered was harsh, but familiar, painted again in colour and warmth. The fear of the night, though never gone, receded into memory. Perhaps they carried it as a quiet lesson. Never be too far from safety before the sun returns. It is difficult for us, surrounded by artificial light, to grasp the depth of that darkness. To Homo habilis, the night was not absence, it was presence, filled with eyes, voices, smells, and movement. Their fear was rational. Their caution was evolution's wisdom at work. And in that tension between helplessness and endurance, between cold and warmth, something distinctly human began to form. Not mastery, but persistence. The knowledge that survival was possible, even without control. When we light a candle, or a campfire, or simply switch on a lamp, we are reenacting an ancient victory over that terror. But for the first humans who looked into the black void of an African night, survival itself was the miracle. They did not yet command the flame. They only awaited the dawn, and in doing so they taught the world what resilience looked like. Imagine this. The heat of the afternoon still shimmers above the cracked soil of an East African plain 2 million years ago. At a shallow waterhole, several shapes gather, small, upright, cautious. One of them kneels, its stone tool flashing briefly in the sun as it chips the hide from a scavenged carcass. Not far away, a broader, more muscular figure crouches, using its thick jaws to chew fibrous roots. A taller one strides in the distance, pausing to scan the horizon with deliberate calm. None of them would know it, but they are distant relatives, cousins in the same evolutionary experiment, sharing a continent, a climate, and a fragile claim on survival. This was not the age of one human species. It was a crowded chapter, a time when multiple versions of us walked the same ground, testing different answers to the same ancient question: how best to live. Around 1,800,000 years ago, Africa was alive with diversity. The fossil record reveals at least 4 distinct kinds of hominin coexisting, each with its own form, diet, and strategy. It was not a tidy sequence of one evolving neatly into the next, but a living mosaic. Homo habilis, the handy toolmaker, Homo erectus, tall and long-legged, already showing hints of endurance and exploration, Homo rudolfensis, with a larger brain but a strangely primitive face, and Paranthropus boisei, the plant-chewing specialist known to history as the Nutcracker Man. Together they made up an evolutionary ecosystem, a clan of cousins who never met but shared the same predators, the same droughts, and perhaps even the same watering holes. In places like Kubifora, on the shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya, and the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, fossils of these species appear in the same geological layers. That means they truly overlapped in time and space. Not in theory, but in fact. Imagine standing there then, the volcanic dust settling from an eruption, the sound of a distant thunder, and nearby, multiple kinds of humans moving through the same savanna, some breaking stones, others foraging for roots. This coexistence forces us to abandon the old ladder image of evolution. There was no single next step. Instead, evolution tried several solutions at once, and only some endured. Let's meet the family. Homo habilis, our central figure, was small and adaptable. They crafted tools, scavenged, and likely ate a varied diet that included meat, fruits, and plants. Their intelligence was growing, but their bodies were still compact, their arms long and their lives short. They survived through versatility, using awareness more than aggression. Then there was Paranthropus boisei, strikingly different. Imagine a skull so robust it could be mistaken for a creature twice its size. Wide cheekbones, a flared zygomatic arch, and a tall sagittal crest that anchored massive chewing muscles. Its molars were the size of coins, worn flat by grinding plant matter. This was not a predator or scavenger, but a vegetarian powerhouse. Fossil isotope analysis of its teeth confirms a diet rich in grasses and sedges, the tough vegetation that blanketed East Africa. To an observer, Paranthropus might have seemed calm and deliberate, plucking tubers or seeds while others fought over meat. But its specialization came at a cost. In a changing climate, a narrow menu could spell extinction. Between these two stood another branch, one that scientists still debate: Homo rudolfensis. Its fossils, particularly the famous skull known as KNM-ER1470, show a puzzling mix. A large brain case for its time, but a face and jaws that still seemed archaic. Rudolfensis might have looked more human than habilis, with a flatter face and smaller brow ridges, yet no one can say how it lived. Some think it was a slightly larger, more advanced cousin of habilis. Others see it as an early offshoot of the genus Homo that experimented with brain expansion before fading from the record. Its discovery at Lake Rudolph, now Turkana, deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Proof that evolution's story is rarely linear. And then, emerging on the same landscape, came Homo erectus, taller, stronger, and with a brain nearly twice the size of Habilis's. The Erectus body was built for travel, with long legs and narrow hips suited for endurance. These early walkers could cover miles of open terrain with ease, their height granting them a better view of predators and prey alike. They were the explorers among this clan, though at this point still bound to Africa's savannas. Their arrival did not erase Habilis overnight. Rather, the two species lived side by side for thousands of generations. Fossil layers from Olduvai and Kubifora even suggest overlapping populations, different versions of humanity watching the same sunsets. This coexistence must have created a rich, if silent, drama. Imagine a watering hole late in the dry season, its edges muddy and crowded. To one side, a group of Paranthropus digs up roots with practiced patience. Nearby, a smaller band of Habilis works with flakes of stone, stripping meat from a scavenged carcass. In the distance, an Erectus figure lopes by, scanning the plain for danger. None of them recognize the others as kin, yet they are all branches from the same evolutionary root. To a modern eye, it would be like witnessing a time-lapse of humanity's own ancestry, the diversity of form and behaviour laid bare in a single frame. The fossil record suggests that these lineages partitioned their environment rather than directly competing. Paranthropus, with its chewing adaptations, thrived in areas rich in vegetation. Habilis, the opportunist, likely exploited the edges, scavenging near water or following predators to feed on leftovers. Rudolfensis, though poorly known, might have occupied intermediate niches, feeding on both plants and small animals. Erectus, the generalist and traveller, could have ranged farther, drawn by the promise of new territory. The savanna was large enough to host them all for a time. Yet coexistence in nature is never peace. Food, water and shelter were finite, and drought could push these species into the same scarce valleys. Perhaps their encounters were fleeting, a distant glimpse, a sound carried on the wind. Or perhaps on rare occasions they saw one another up close. What would that have felt like? To see a creature that moved like you, but looked slightly wrong. The same upright posture, the same hands, the same eyes, but different enough to stir unease. We will never know how much awareness of self existed then. But these meetings must have been eerie reflections in the mirror of evolution. In the laboratories of modern paleoanthropology, scientists still debate where to draw the lines. Were Habilis and Rudolfensis truly separate species, or simply regional variations of the same lineage? Did Erectus emerge from Habilis, or were both descendants of a common ancestor that has yet to be found? The evidence remains fragmentary, bits of skulls, teeth, and long bones, scattered across the sediments of East Africa. Yet, taken together, they tell a single story. Evolution is not a march, but a multitude. In this crowded landscape, Homo habilis takes on new meaning. It was not the first human, nor the inevitable step toward modernity. It was one of several remarkable experiments in adaptation. Its small hands shaped stone, its eyes read the movement of predators, its mind balanced fear and opportunity. It may have watched taller cousins walk by and robust neighbours grind roots nearby, and still found its own rhythm in the chaos. For a few 100,000 years it succeeded, not as the winner of some contest, but as one survivor among many. If we could stand at that ancient waterhole and look around, we would see ourselves reflected in the diversity of those early species. Each one embodied a different answer to the same question evolution always asks: how to live in a changing world. And though only one lineage would carry the story forward, the others were not failures. They were chapters, full and complete, in the book of human becoming. Long before our species imagined unity, we were a crowd. We were plural from the beginning. Many kin, many paths, walking together under the same African sun. Imagine this, the rhythmic clack of stone against stone echoing across a lakeshore nearly 1,700,000 years ago. A small figure crouches, turning a rounded cobble in its hand, testing its edges, then striking again with deliberate force. Flakes fly. For a moment the gesture looks familiar, an ancient rhythm that had already shaped generations before. But then something new happens. The creature pauses, examines the result, turns the rock, and strikes again. Not randomly, but with symmetry in mind. The flakes now fall away in a pattern, controlled, purposeful, predictable. For the first time, a mind isn't just breaking stone, it's designing it. This is where technology became geometry, and where the Stone Age, as we truly know it, began. The world around this scene was changing. Africa, at the dawn of the early Pleistocene, was a continent in transition. The climate swung between wet and dry pulses, and with it, grasslands expanded and contracted like a breathing lung. The old habitats of wooded riversides still existed, but open savannas were now stretching farther and farther. Animals grew larger, herds moved farther, and those who fed on them had to adapt. And as landscapes grew wider, so did the minds that navigated them. Around this time, a new kind of human appeared, taller, broader-shouldered, and with a brain more than half again as large as that of the old handyman. This was Homo erectus, the walker, the innovator, the one who would take the tools of Africa and carry them across the world. But before the migrations came the idea, an idea that could be held in the palm of a hand, the Acheulean hand axe. To our eyes, it looks deceptively simple. A teardrop-shaped stone, sharp on all sides, tapering to a point. Yet to make one, the maker had to visualize the finished form inside the raw rock, and then remove everything that wasn't part of it. That act required abstraction, patience, and the ability to hold an image in the mind. In other words, it required thought of a kind that went beyond reaction. The hand axe was not born in a single strike of inspiration, but out of many thousands of quiet experiments. At sites like Kukisele in Kenya, on the banks of an ancient river, archaeologists have found layers of tools, some crude, like those of the Olduvai tradition, and some unmistakably Acheulean. The sediments tell a story of overlap, a kind of technological crossroads. In those layers, the world of Homo habilis and Homo erectus coexisted for a while, one still breaking stones by instinct, the other shaping them by design. It is as if one species still saw a rock as a tool, while the other began to see it as an idea. The Acheulean was a revolution not of new material but of new intention. Unlike the quick flakes of the Olduvai toolkit, sharp but disposable, the hand axe was made to last. It was symmetrical, balanced, and could be resharpened many times. It cut, scraped, dug, and hammered. Some were as small as a fist, others nearly the size of a human head. Their sharpness could butcher the flesh of elephants, dismember a carcass, or peel bark from wood. To call it a tool almost undersells it. It was a philosophy of preparation, an object meant to serve many roles in many situations. And unlike the crude flakes, these new hand axes were not made in haste. The makers selected specific types of rock, fine-grained basalt, quartzite, or flint, carried from kilometres away. This suggests foresight, the ability to plan for a future task not yet encountered. One can imagine the scene. A young Homo erectus walking along a dry riverbed, spotting a piece of stone glinting in the sun, and knowing instantly that it would become something useful, though not today. That sense of potential, of delayed gratification, is one of the most human capacities of all. At Kukisele, the layers where Olduvai and Acheulean tools overlap mark one of the great transitions in prehistory. Perhaps the last of the habilis toolmakers still chipped away at the old designs, while, nearby, the first of the erectus craftsmen carved the future into stone. The difference wasn't just in the tools, It was in the thinking. The Acheulean maker saw symmetry, balance, and pattern. This suggests a cognitive leap. The brain was now capable of visualizing a form before creating it, of imagining something that did not yet exist. In that leap, humanity took one of its first steps toward art, architecture, and design, long before anyone could give those words meaning. The spread of Acheulean tools tells another story, one of expansion. From Africa's Rift Valley, they appear across the continent and soon after into the Middle East and parts of Europe. Yet interestingly, the earliest Homo erectus fossils outside Africa, like those found at Dmanisi in Georgia, show that some groups left before mastering the hand axe. The ones who ventured north carried the older Olduvai-style flakes instead. This means that migration did not depend on technology alone. Perhaps they left too early, or simply adapted their tools to what local materials allowed. But it also suggests that humanity's story was never uniform. Even the great innovations spread unevenly, echoing across landscapes like ripples from a single stone dropped into an ancient lake. What drove Homo erectus to refine its tools so dramatically? Some scientists believe the answer lies in food. Bigger bodies and bigger brains needed more calories. The Acheulean hand axe could butcher animals efficiently, split large bones for marrow and process tough plants. With every improvement in stonecraft came better access to energy, and with more energy came more capacity for innovation. It was a feedback loop between diet and design, biology and technology. The tools didn't just serve survival, they sustained the minds that imagined better tools. But there is also an aesthetic dimension that cannot be ignored. Some hand axes are so perfectly symmetrical, so over-engineered for function, that they verge on art. Their symmetry may have been unnecessary from a purely practical standpoint, and yet the makers continued to refine it for over 1 million years. This consistency across continents and centuries hints at something more than utility. It may have been a sense of beauty, or simply satisfaction in mastery. A mind that could recognize better, that could feel the difference between crude and refined, was already touching the beginnings of symbolic thought. By around 1,600,000 years ago, the Acheulean had spread across much of Africa. The world of Homo habilis, with its small flakes and scavenged meals, was fading into memory. The torch of innovation had passed, quietly but decisively. It was not a revolution of violence or conquest, but one of refinement. Evolution's great experiment with intelligence had entered its next phase, where each improvement in a stone mirrored an improvement in the mind that shaped it. To stand in a modern museum today, holding an Acheulean hand axe behind glass, is to hold time itself. The edges are still sharp. The symmetry is still clear. You can feel the weight of it, perfectly balanced in the palm. And you realize that it was made not by accident, but by intention, by someone who thought ahead, who planned, who cared about how it felt to hold. The hand axe is both artifact and mirror. It reflects the dawn of conscious craftsmanship, the moment when our ancestors began not just to survive, but to shape the world around them deliberately. If the Olduvai tools of Homo habilis mark the first spark of human invention, then the Acheulean hand axe was the first flame, a controlled, purposeful blaze of creativity. The apprentice had become the craftsman, and the Stone Age would never look the same again. Imagine this. The sun is setting over an ancient river plain in East Africa, its orange light softening the edges of the world. The air hums with the same sounds it has for millions of years. Insects, distant thunder, and the low rumble of herds moving toward evening water. Among the grasses, a small figure walks upright carrying a worn stone flake. It pauses, scanning the horizon, cautious and alert. This is Homo habilis, the handyman, still surviving in a world that is quietly leaving them behind. They do not know that they are the last of their kind. No disaster will mark their end. No ash layer or fossil bed will capture their final moment. Their disappearance will be slow, silent, and unnoticed, the way most endings in nature truly are. By around 1,600,000 years ago, the evolutionary stage was becoming more crowded and more demanding. Homo erectus had already arrived, with longer limbs, larger bodies, and brains approaching twice the size of Homo habilis. These new humans were spreading into new territories, from East Africa's rift valleys to arid plains and beyond. They carried better tools, the elegant Herculean hand axes, and could travel longer distances to hunt or forage. Fossils show that both species shared the same landscapes for thousands of years, but when their remains appear side by side, the story they tell is one of uneven strength. Homo erectus left more traces, more tools, more evidence of a species thriving. Homo habilis gradually fades from view. This decline wasn't likely caused by a single catastrophic event. Instead, it was ecological pressure applied over hundreds of generations. The world was drying once more, forests shrinking, grasslands expanding, water sources becoming unpredictable. In such an environment, flexibility and endurance became the keys to survival. The short, long-armed habilis, built for climbing and cautious foraging, may have been outmatched by a taller, more mobile relative that could follow migrating herds across vast distances. While Homo habilis still relied on simple flakes and opportunistic scavenging, Homo erectus wielded more advanced tools and, perhaps more importantly, more complex cooperation. Competition in prehistory is rarely direct. One species does not necessarily hunt another into extinction. More often, one simply fills the space more efficiently, leaving less behind for the other. That may have been the case here. Homo habilis was already adapted to a very specific way of life. Mixed feeding, tool use for scavenging, modest group structures. When those ecological opportunities began to close, when carcasses became scarcer, when other predators grew bolder, and when Homo erectus began exploiting wider diets, habilis may have been slowly pushed into marginal habitats, smaller refuges where survival became harder with each passing millennium. At the same time, the distinction between Homo habilis and its successors may not have been absolute. Some scientists suggest that Homo habilis did not truly vanish but was gradually absorbed, its populations blending with emerging forms of early Homo erectus or Homo rudolfensis. The fossil record blurs the line between them. Skulls from sites like Kubifora and Olduvai Gorge show a mosaic of features. Faces partway between habilis and erectus, hands still dexterous, but bodies more robust. It may not have been a simple extinction, but a slow transformation, evolution unfolding so gently that no generation would have noticed. The old shape of humanity simply merged into the new. Yet there is another possibility, that habilis lingered on in small, isolated populations, living out its final chapters in ecological niches no one else wanted, pockets of woodland, dry gullies, or river edges that offered just enough resources to endure. These would have been the holdouts, the last craftsmen of the older one tradition, still breaking simple flakes from cobbles long after others had learned to shape stone into symmetry. In this version of history, Homo habilis does not evolve upward but endures sideways, stubbornly clinging to a familiar rhythm of life until the environment no longer allows it. To understand their end, one must imagine their beginning. When Homo habilis first appeared, around 2.5 million years ago, they were pioneers, the first of their genus to hold thought and stone in the same hand. They lived in a world of opportunity, where using tools meant unlocking marrow and meat that no other ape could reach. But in evolution, the tools that open one door may not open the next. Their flakes and choppers were once revolutionary, but by 1.5 million years ago, they were outdated technology in a new competitive landscape. Innovation had passed them by, not with malice, but with quiet inevitability. We can picture the final generations, small bands scattered across the Rift Valley, using the last riverbeds that still held water, gathering tubers, scavenging kills when they could, perhaps still shaping stones with the same gestures passed down for hundreds of thousands of years. Around them, the world grew louder, new predators, new humans, new ways of surviving. For Homo habilis, life likely continued as it always had: wake, forage, flee, eat, rest. But the balance between danger and safety shifted just enough to make the difference. One drought too long, one generation too few, one territory lost to a faster, more organised cousin, and the thread snapped quietly. In the sediments of Olduvai Gorge and Kubifora, the fossils tell this story without words. Layers once rich in Homo habilis remains give way to layers dominated by Homo erectus. The stone tools evolve too. Simple flakes replaced by bifaces, crude percussion replaced by careful shaping. The torch of cognition passed silently from one species to the next. There is no sign of struggle, no sudden collapse, only absence. The hands that once shaped the first stones were gone, their legacy living on in the sharper, more complex tools that followed. Extinction is often misunderstood as failure. In truth, Homo habilis succeeded beyond measure. They survived across continents and climates for more than 500,000 years, far longer than modern humanity has so far existed. They gave the world its first tools, its first flexible intelligence, its first spark of technological imagination. If they disappeared, it was only because they had already done their part. Their lineage, whether through direct descent or influence, seeded everything that came after. The end of Homo habilis was not a fall, but a quiet merging into the river of change that defines all life. Standing at the edge of their story, we can look back and see how far they had brought us. From forest-dwelling apes to upright walkers, from opportunists to innovators, Homo habilis had already rewritten the rules of survival. When they finally vanished, the world did not notice, but the path they carved remained open. Their tools lay scattered across the plains, their fingerprints pressed into the clay of human ancestry. The next species would pick them up, refine them, and carry the story forward. In the end, Homo habilis left behind no monuments, no art, no language. Only stones, bones, and the echo of a question older than history. What happens to those who invent the future but are not part of it? Imagine this, a cracked pebble, half buried in the ochre dust of East Africa. It catches the light for a moment, no different from the millions of others scattered across the ancient plain. But look closer, and you'll see something subtle, an edge too sharp, a fracture too deliberate, the unmistakable trace of intention. 2 million years ago, a hand shaped this stone. It was a small act, barely a flicker in the vast timeline of life, but it carried within it a new kind of thought, the idea that the world could be altered. That gesture, that spark of recognition, would one day give rise to everything we call human. From that first chipped stone, an unbroken thread winds through time, through the bones and tools of Homo habilis, through the firelit camps of Homo erectus, through the painted caves of Ice Age artists, through the steel and glass of our cities, and even through the silent hum of machines orbiting the planet. The story of humanity doesn't begin with language or art or empire. It begins with the moment a creature picked up a rock and realised it could change something. Homo habilis didn't just invent a tool, they invented the possibility of invention. Their world was small, rivers, grasslands, predators, survival, yet their minds stretched beyond it. They learned to break stone along predictable lines, to hold a pattern in their heads, and coax it into being. Those first flakes and choppers were crude, but they carried the seed of something extraordinary, abstraction. To take a raw object and imagine what it could become is one of the deepest acts of creativity. It is the same impulse that drives an artist to shape clay, a scientist to design an experiment, or an engineer to build a spacecraft. In the gesture of Homo habilis, turning a stone and striking with intent, lies the origin of that continuum. Their tools were not symbols yet, not art, not communication, but they were thought made visible. They embodied foresight, a recognition that cause could lead to effect, that a strike now could solve a problem later. Every flake chipped from a core was a hypothesis tested in real time. The sharp edge was knowledge, and with knowledge came a new way of existing. The Olduvai toolkit, those simple flakes, scrapers and cores, was less about what it could cut and more about what it meant, that an animal had crossed the invisible line between reacting to the world and reshaping it. We often imagine our species' ascent as a story of triumph, a steady climb from primitive to civilized. But Homo habilis reminds us that progress is never clean and never guaranteed. They lived on the edge of extinction for hundreds of thousands of years, without mastery over fire, without safety in the dark, without certainty that tomorrow would bring food or water. Yet they persisted, not through dominance, but through adaptability, through cleverness, cooperation, and curiosity. In their small hands, survival became a creative act. That is their legacy. The realization that thought could be a tool just as much as stone. When we hold one of their tools today, worn, weathered, its maker long vanished, we are holding the oldest expression of mind preserved in matter. These stones are the earliest conversations between intelligence and the material world. They whisper across the ages that consciousness is not static, but cumulative. Each generation learns, adapts, and passes something forward, even if they never knew they were doing it. Homo habilis could not have imagined what would come of their innovation. The firelight, the paintings, the metal, the algorithms. Yet all of it can be traced back to their discovery that thought could leave a mark. 2 million years later, we live surrounded by the descendants of that first stone. Every object we touch, from a spoon to a smartphone, carries its genetic inheritance. The difference is scale, not essence. Each invention is still an answer to the same ancient impulse, to extend the limits of our body and our mind through the world around us. The flake became the knife, the hand axe became the hammer, the wheel became the engine, and the spark of curiosity became civilization. If Homo habilis taught us anything, it's that every great transformation begins small, in the quiet, in the ordinary, in the mind of a being who sees what could be instead of only what is. Their name, the handy man, may sound quaint, but it is deeply symbolic. Hands are not just instruments of manipulation, they are instruments of imagination. The same neural circuits that plan a grip also plan an idea. In every chipped flake lies evidence of a mind thinking ahead, predicting how a stone will break, how an edge will feel, how it might help tomorrow's meal. In that way, Homo habilis was not just using tools. They were learning to think in sequences, to link actions to consequences. This is the foundation of logic, of language, of science. The mind that learned to carve a rock was learning to carve time itself. We do not know what they felt or how they saw their world, but we can guess something of their perception. Perhaps when they looked at the landscape, they did not just see food or danger. Perhaps they began to see opportunity. A rock was not just a rock anymore. A bone was not just a carcass. A horizon was not just the edge of sight, but a place to go. That quiet redefinition of reality, of perceiving potential, is the dawn of imagination. It is the moment our ancestors stopped being passive participants in nature and started becoming its collaborators. Today, in a lab, a scientist uses a microscope to study neurons firing as someone plans a movement. The image glows on a screen, light patterns mapping thought. And somewhere deep in that pattern, there is a ghost of Homo habilis. Because those neurons, that capacity for anticipation, for creativity, for abstraction, was first sculpted by the demands of shaping stone. When you pick up a pen, type a sentence, or fix something broken, you are performing an echo of that ancient act. The rhythm of hand and mind working together is our oldest inheritance. It's easy to overlook the humble beginnings of humanity, to think of them as distant curiosities in a museum case. But in truth, their fingerprints are still on everything we do. The architecture of our cities, the logic of our language, the rhythm of our problem solving, all trace back to that evolutionary moment when intelligence and matter first met. Homo habilis may have disappeared from the Earth 1.5 million years ago, but their legacy never did. It is written into our nervous systems, into the way we perceive tools, patterns, and purpose. In the end, evolution is not a ladder but a web, and Homo habilis is one of its first shining threads. They did not know they were beginning a story. They were simply surviving. Yet survival itself, when done with thought, becomes invention. The cracked pebble in the dust is more than a fossil. It is a message. That intelligence need not be grand to be powerful, and that every great creation begins with curiosity and persistence. As we look up tonight at the lights of our cities, or the satellites tracing lines through the dark sky, we can follow that unbroken chain of invention backward through time, back past fire and bronze and language, back to a riverbank in Africa where a small being turned a stone in its hand and saw, perhaps for the first time, what it could become. That was the first idea, the first creation, the first step on the road to everything